Welcome to the darker corners of the wizarding world, where shadows hold secrets and magic carries a terrible price. Tonight, we journey through the most disturbing moments and darkest lore that shaped the Harry Potter universe. Stories that reveal the true cost of magic, the depths of human cruelty, and the sacrifices made in the name of power. As you settle into peaceful slumber, let these haunting tales wash over you like whispered secrets in the night, reminding us that even in worlds of wonder, darkness lurks beneath the surface, waiting to be explored by those brave enough to listen. In the rolling hills of Little Hangleton, where ancient magic has soured like milk left too long in summer heat, there stands a shack that has known generations of darkness. The gaunt family home squats among overgrown nettles and twisted trees, its walls green with moss and decay, its windows thick with grime that no amount of cleaning could ever remove. This is not mere neglect, but something deeper, a corruption that seeps from the very bones of the building into the soil beneath, poisoning everything it touches with the accumulated weight of centuries of hatred, violence, and despair. The structure itself seems to recoil from the light, hidden among tangled trunks that block the sun and deny the valley's beauty to those trapped within. Tiles have fallen from the roof like broken teeth, revealing rafters that jut skyward like the ribs of some massive, decomposing beast. The nettles that surround the building grow with unnatural vigor, their stinging leaves reaching toward the grimy windows, as if trying to complete the structure's isolation from the world of ordinary human decency. But the true horror of this place lies not in its physical decay, but in the poisonous legacy of the family that has called it home for generations uncounted. The gaunts represent everything toxic about pure blood supremacy taken to its logical, devastating conclusion. A family so obsessed with maintaining the purity of their magical bloodline that they have bred themselves into madness, violence, and spiritual corruption that would make even seasoned Aurors weep with revulsion. Marvolo Gaunt, patriarch of this diseased dynasty, embodies the particular evil that comes from believing oneself inherently superior to other human beings, based solely on the circumstances of one's birth. His wizened face bears the unmistakable signs of generations of inbreeding: the drooping eyelids, the slack jaw, the yellowed teeth that speak of genetic material recycled too many times through too small a gene pool. But it is his eyes that reveal the true depth of his corruption, burning with a fanatic zeal for pure blood supremacy that has consumed every other human emotion, leaving only hatred and a grotesque pride in bloodline that has produced nothing but monsters. The squalor in which Marvolo chooses to live is itself a form of violence against his children, a deliberate cultivation of misery that serves his twisted philosophy. The family possesses ancient treasures: Salazar Slytherin's locket, the resurrection stone set in a ring that has been passed down through generations. Yet they live in conditions that would shame even the poorest Muggle families. This is not poverty born of circumstance, but poverty as ideology, a rejection of anything that might connect them to the broader human community they despise so thoroughly. His treatment of his daughter Merope reveals the particular cruelty that patriarchal power can inflict when combined with magical supremacist ideology. She moves through the shack like a ghost, her shoulders hunched in permanent expectation of violence, her hands trembling as she performs the endless, thankless labor that keeps their wretched household functioning. When she dares to show even the slightest interest in the Muggle boy who rides past their hovel, Marvolo's rage is volcanic in its intensity, a fury born not just from personal anger, but from the violation of everything he considers sacred about blood purity. The psychological torture he inflicts upon her is systematic and comprehensive, designed to break her spirit so completely that she will never again dare to think thoughts that challenge his worldview. He screams at her with the particular viciousness that comes from believing absolutely in one's right to dominate those deemed inferior. His hands shake not with age, but with the barely contained violence that courses through him like poison, seeking outlets in cruelty toward those too weak to resist his malevolent authority. When ministry officials arrive to investigate magical disturbances, Marvolo's interaction with them reveals the depth of his delusion about his family's importance in the wizarding world. He speaks of their pure blood heritage as if it were a sacred trust, displaying Slytherin's locket and the ancient ring as if they were proof of inherent worth, rather than mere objects, whose true power he is too ignorant and corrupted to understand. His pride in possessions he cannot properly use while living in conditions of utter squalor demonstrates the particular madness that comes from valuing symbols over substance, breeding over achievement, ancestry over character. But perhaps even more disturbing than Marvolo's obvious evil is his son Morfin, whose twisted nature represents what happens when supremacist ideology combines with genuine mental instability to create something approaching pure malevolence. Where his father's cruelty serves an ideology, however warped, Morfin's violence seems to spring from a deeper well of sadistic pleasure in causing suffering to those he considers beneath his notice. His hobby of hexing muggles who venture too near their property is not mere mischief but a systematic campaign of terror against innocent people whose only crime is existing in proximity to his family's domain. The curses he uses are chosen not for their effectiveness, but for their capacity to cause maximum humiliation and pain, magical violations that leave his victims confused, terrified, and often permanently damaged by experiences they cannot understand or explain to anyone who might help them. The particular pleasure Morfin takes in these attacks reveals something deeply disturbing about how magical supremacist ideology can corrupt even basic human empathy. He does not see his muggle victims as people, but as objects existing solely for his amusement, their suffering nothing more than entertainment. For someone whose sense of self-worth depends entirely on his ability to cause pain to those who cannot retaliate effectively, his collection of trophies from these attacks, buttons torn from clothing, personal items stolen during moments of terror, speaks to a mindset that has moved far beyond mere prejudice into something approaching the psychology of a serial killer. Each object represents not just a victim but a moment when Morfin felt the intoxicating rush of absolute power over another human being, the addictive sensation of watching fear bloom in someone's eyes as they realize their complete helplessness in the face of forces they cannot comprehend. The Ministry's eventual discovery of his crimes leads not to justice but to a travesty that demonstrates how institutional corruption can enable individual evil to flourish unchecked. His imprisonment in Azkaban, while legally justified, comes only after years of attacks on innocent muggles, and even then serves primarily to protect the wizarding world's secrecy rather than to deliver justice for his victims. The systematic failure to protect those whom the magical community considers beneath their concern reveals how prejudice can become institutionalized to the point where entire populations are effectively abandoned to the mercy of those who view them as less than human. But it is in the tragedy of Merope Gaunt that we see perhaps the most heartbreaking consequences of growing up in an environment where love has been replaced by ideology and violence has become the primary form of communication between family members. Her entire childhood and adolescence unfold under the constant threat of her father's rage and her brother's casual cruelty, creating psychological wounds that will never fully heal and shaping her understanding of relationships in ways that will ultimately prove catastrophic for both herself and the child she will bear. The systematic abuse she endures goes far beyond physical violence, to include the kind of emotional torture that destroys the victim's sense of self-worth and agency. She is taught from birth that her value as a person depends entirely on her blood status and her compliance with her family's twisted version of magical supremacy. Any display of independent thought or personal desire is met with such overwhelming punishment that she learns to hide her true feelings behind a mask of sullen compliance that never quite conceals the spark of desperate longing for something better than the hell in which she has been trapped. Her attraction to Tom Riddle Sr. represents not just romantic interest, but a desperate psychological escape from the suffocating world of pure-blood fanaticism that has been her prison since birth. In this handsome muggle boy who rides past their hovel without fear or hatred, she sees everything her family is not: youth, beauty, freedom from the poisonous ideology that has corrupted every relationship in her life. But her approach to winning his affection reveals how thoroughly her upbringing has damaged her understanding of love, consent, and healthy relationships. The love potion she uses to enslave Tom Riddle Sr. is not born from malice, but from a desperation so complete that she cannot conceive of any other way to achieve the connection she craves. Having never experienced genuine affection or witnessed a relationship based on mutual respect and choice, she understands love only as a form of possession, a magical compulsion that forces the desired person to provide the emotional sustenance that has been denied to her throughout her traumatic childhood. The months during which she keeps him under magical influence represent a grotesque parody of romance, a relationship built entirely on deception and supernatural coercion that satisfies her desperate need for companionship, while slowly poisoning whatever capacity for genuine love she might have retained. Despite her horrific upbringing, she experiences the tenderness and attention she has always craved, but knows in her heart that none of it is real, that she is living a lie that grows more unsustainable with each passing day. Her decision to release him from the love potion's influence, hoping that he might have come to care for her genuinely during their time together, demonstrates both the depth of her delusion and the tragic remnant of humanity that survives, even in someone raised in such a toxic environment. She chooses to believe that love might have grown where only magical compulsion existed, that the man she has held prisoner might have learned to appreciate the woman who had enslaved him. His immediate abandonment upon regaining his free will represents not just personal rejection, but the complete collapse of her desperate gamble for escape from the life of misery and hatred that has been her birthright. She finds herself pregnant and alone, cast out by her family for the crime of loving a muggle, and abandoned by the man whose love she had tried to steal through magical means. The child growing within her becomes both her last hope for redemption and the vessel for all the poisonous legacy of her family's accumulated darkness. Her death in childbirth at the London orphanage represents the final tragedy of a life that never had a genuine chance for happiness or fulfillment. She dies alone among strangers, her son's first breath coinciding with her last, creating a void that will shape his character in ways even more terrible than her own traumatic upbringing. The love she might have given him dies with her, leaving only the genetic heritage of magical power combined with the spiritual vacuum that comes from being born unwanted and unloved. The orphanage staff who find her body see only another young woman who has died in childbirth, a common enough tragedy in their experience that merits little investigation or concern. They cannot see the magical bloodlines that converge in her corpse, cannot understand that her death represents the end of one of wizarding history's most ancient pure-blood dynasties, and the beginning of something far darker and more dangerous than anything the Gaunts themselves had ever produced. Her son, Tom Marvolo Riddle, inherits not just her magical abilities, but the psychological wounds inflicted by generations of abuse, supremacist ideology, and emotional starvation. In him, the Gaunt family's obsession with blood purity will find its most perfect and terrible expression, their capacity for cruelty refined and amplified beyond anything his ancestors could have imagined. The shack in Little Hangleton stands empty now, but its poison has already been released into the world through the child who carries within him all of his family's darkness and none of their human limitations. The decay that consumed the Gaunt family over centuries represents more than just the decline of a particular pureblood dynasty, but a cautionary tale about how ideology can corrupt human relationships so completely that love itself becomes impossible. Their obsession with maintaining magical superiority through inbreeding and isolation created a closed system that fed upon itself until nothing remained but hatred, violence, and the kind of spiritual emptiness that can only be filled through the suffering of others. In the end, the Gaunt Shack stands as a monument to the inevitable consequences of supremacist thinking taken to its logical conclusion. The nettles grow higher each year, the roof falls further into decay, and the windows grow thicker with grime. But the real damage has already been done. The poison that festered within those walls has been released into the wizarding world through Tom Riddle, carrying with it all the accumulated evil of a family that chose hatred over love, ideology over humanity, and power over every virtue that makes life worth living. The lesson embedded in their tragedy extends far beyond the boundaries of the wizarding world, speaking to the universal human capacity for creating hell on earth through the systematic choice of cruelty over kindness, fear over understanding, and the worship of blood and breeding over the cultivation of wisdom and compassion. In understanding how the Gaunts became monsters, we glimpse the terrible truth that evil is not born but made, created through choices repeated so many times that they become character repeated so often that it becomes destiny, and destiny pursued so relentlessly that it consumes not just the individual, but everyone unlucky enough to be caught in its expanding circle of destruction. In the grey stones of Wool's orphanage, where London's unwanted children learn that the world offers neither comfort nor kindness to those born without advantage, there lived a boy whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the air around him. Tom Marvolo Riddle arrived on a December night when snow fell like ash from the wartime sky, his mother's dying breath still warm in the delivery room as he drew his first. From that moment of simultaneous birth and death, he carried within him a void that no amount of human affection could ever fill, though none would be offered in the austere halls where society's discarded children learned to survive without love. The orphanage itself was a monument to institutional indifference, its corridors echoing with the hollow sounds of footsteps on worn linoleum and the distant crying of children who had long since learned that tears brought no comfort. The walls, painted in shades of institutional green that seemed designed to crush any lingering hope, bore witness to decades of small tragedies. Children who aged out of the system into lives of poverty and desperation. Families torn apart by war and want. Dreams that died before they could properly take root in soil, too poisoned by neglect to nurture anything beautiful or good. Mrs. Cole, the orphanage director, presided over this kingdom of the forgotten with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too much human misery to be shocked by anything. Yet even she would remember Tom Riddle with a shudder that had nothing to do with the cold that perpetually seeped through the building's inadequate heating system. There was something about the boy that unsettled her from his earliest days, and quality she could never quite name, but that made her unconsciously avoid his direct gaze and hurry past his crib during her nightly rounds. As an infant, Tom rarely cried, a silence that might have been interpreted as contentment, if not for the unsettling intelligence that seemed to burn behind his dark eyes. While other babies reached toward faces with the instinctive trust of creatures designed to elicit care and protection, Tom studied the adults around him with a calculating awareness that belonged in no child's expression. His gaze followed movement with predatory focus, cataloguing weaknesses and reactions with the systematic thoroughness of someone much older and infinitely more dangerous. His first signs of magic manifested not through the accidental outbursts common to magical children, but through deliberate acts that seemed designed to test the boundaries of what he could achieve and how much he could control. Objects would move when he stared at them with sufficient intensity, always, when no adult was watching directly, but frequently enough that the staff began to develop an unconscious unease about the boy who never seemed to be where trouble started, but was somehow always present when it reached its conclusion. The incident with Billy Stubbs's rabbit marked the first clear indication that Tom's magical abilities were developing in directions that had nothing to do with childish wonder or innocent exploration. The animal had been the 8-year-old Billy's only source of comfort in a world that offered precious little kindness to unwanted children, a small brown creature that provided the unconditional affection that no human in the orphanage had ever shown him. Its presence in the dormitory was technically against regulations, but Mrs. Cole had allowed it to remain because she understood that sometimes love comes in forms that bureaucracy cannot accommodate. When the rabbit was found hanging from the rafters in the orphanage attic, its small body twisted in ways that suggested both deliberate cruelty and an understanding of anatomy that no normal child should possess. The staff struggled to comprehend how such a thing could have happened. There were no signs of struggle in the room below, no indication that the animal had been taken by force. Yet somehow it had ended up in a location that would have required considerable planning and effort to reach. Billy's reaction to the discovery was heartbreaking in its complete devastation. The kind of grief that comes from losing the only source of love in a life already marked by abandonment and neglect. But it was Tom's response that truly disturbed those who witnessed it. Not the cruel satisfaction that might be expected from a child who had committed such an act, but a clinical detachment that suggested he viewed Billy's suffering as an interesting experiment in human emotion rather than a tragedy that demanded empathy or remorse. The other children began to fear him with the instinctive recognition that prey animals have for predators, though none could articulate exactly what made him different from the usual bullies who plagued institutional life. His threats were never direct, his violence never overt enough to warrant the kind of punishment that the staff could justify administering. Instead, he wielded his emerging powers with the subtlety of someone who understood that the most effective cruelty was that which could not be proven or punished by conventional means. Amy Benson and Dennis Bishop's experience in the cave during that summer outing to the seaside would haunt both children for the rest of their lives, though neither would ever speak of what happened during the hours they spent trapped in the darkness with Tom Riddle. The official story, that they had simply gotten lost while exploring and had been frightened by the experience, satisfied the authorities who investigated the incident. But the lasting psychological damage to both children suggested trauma far more severe than simple disorientation could explain. The cave itself was a natural formation carved by centuries of tidal action, its entrance partially concealed by fallen rocks and overgrown with vegetation that made it appear more like a crack in the cliff face than an actual opening. Local children sometimes dared each other to explore its shallow depths, but most lost their nerve before venturing far enough to discover the deeper chambers that Tom had somehow identified during his brief survey of the area. What Amy and Dennis experienced in those hidden depths was never fully revealed, but the changes in their behavior following the incident spoke to encounters with something that challenged their fundamental understanding of what was possible in the world. Amy, previously an outgoing child who had managed to maintain some optimism despite her circumstances, became withdrawn and fearful, starting at unexpected sounds and refusing to be alone with Tom, even in the supervised common areas of the orphanage. Dennis developed a stutter that would plague him for years, his words catching in his throat whenever he tried to speak about anything connected to that day by the sea. Both children began experiencing nightmares that left them screaming in the dormitory at night, their terror so genuine and persistent that Mrs. Cole eventually had to separate them from the other children to prevent their hysteria from spreading throughout the orphanage population. The staff noticed that Tom's demeanor following the cave incident carried a new confidence, a subtle but unmistakable air of someone who had discovered capabilities that set him apart from ordinary children in ways that went far beyond the magical accidents that occasionally disrupted orphanage routine. His interactions with other children took on a quality of ownership, as if he had learned something during those hours in the cave that gave him power over those who had shared the experience with him. His ability to speak to snakes manifested during this period, though initially it was dismissed as childhood imagination by adults who witnessed his one-sided conversations with the garden snakes that inhabited the orphanage grounds. The serpent's behavior around him was distinctly unusual. They approached him without fear, seemed to respond to his whispered words, and occasionally acted in ways that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. When other children who had crossed Tom suffered mysterious accidents involving snake bites or encounters with the reptiles in places where they had no natural reason to be, the control he exercised over animals extended beyond reptiles to include the rats that infested the orphanage buildings and the stray cats that haunted the nearby alleys. These creatures became extensions of his will, appearing and disappearing according to patterns that served his purposes rather than their natural behaviors. Children who defied him might find their dormitory rooms invaded by rats during the night, or discover that the cats they had befriended suddenly turned hostile, hissing and clawing at approaches that had previously been welcomed. Mrs. Cole's growing unease about Tom reached a crisis point when she began to suspect that his influence over the other children went beyond the usual social dynamics of institutional life. There was something unnatural about the way conflicts resolved in his favor, how children who opposed him invariably found themselves isolated and afraid, how even the staff seemed to unconsciously defer to his presence despite his young age and supposedly powerless position as just another unwanted orphan. Her attempts to discipline him proved frustratingly ineffective, not because he openly defied authority, but because evidence of his wrongdoing always seemed to evaporate under scrutiny. Witnesses became unreliable, their stories changing or becoming confused when pressed for details. Physical evidence disappeared or could be explained by coincidence. Even his most obvious victims seemed reluctant to provide testimony that might lead to consequences for their tormentor, as if they feared retaliation worse than the original offense. The wartime context of London during Tom's childhood provided perfect camouflage for the development of his darker abilities, as the chaos of bombing raids and evacuation procedures created numerous opportunities for unexplained incidents to be attributed to the general disruption of normal life. Children disappeared into evacuation programs and never returned, their fates lost in the bureaucratic confusion that marked those desperate years. Strange accidents that might have attracted investigation under normal circumstances were dismissed as collateral damage from the broader conflict consuming the city around them. Tom learned to navigate this environment with predatory efficiency, understanding that crisis creates opportunity for those willing to exploit others' vulnerabilities. He discovered that adults distracted by war and survival had less attention to spare for the subtle signs of predation among their charges, that institutional systems stretched beyond capacity would accept explanations that avoided additional complications, and that other children traumatized by the broader violence of their world, were less likely to resist or report additional abuse from their peers. His collection of personal trophies from other children began during this period, though he was careful to take items whose absence would not be immediately noticed or could be attributed to the general disorder of institutional life. A button from a favorite shirt, a small toy that provided comfort during the long nights when air raid sirens sent everyone to the basement shelters, a photograph that represented the last connection to a family that would never return. These became symbols of his power over others, physical proof of his ability to take whatever he desired without consequence. The psychological techniques he developed for manipulating both children and adults showed a sophistication that belonged in no 11-year-old mind, yet arose naturally from his combination of magical ability, emotional emptiness, and intellectual precocity. He learned to identify each person's deepest fears and desires, then used that knowledge to craft approaches that made resistance seem futile and cooperation appear logical. His victims often felt grateful for his attention, unaware that they were being systematically stripped of agency and dignity. When Professor Dumbledore arrived at the orphanage to discuss Tom's admission to Hogwarts, the meeting revealed layers of manipulation that had been years in the making. Tom's performance during the interview was masterful in its calculated charm, presenting exactly the image of a gifted but troubled child that would evoke sympathy while concealing the predatory intelligence that had been feeding on the suffering of those around him since early childhood. The burning wardrobe incident that concluded their meeting was both demonstration of power and subtle threat. Tom's way of establishing that he was not simply another victim of circumstances, but someone whose capabilities extended far beyond what normal authority structures could contain or control. Dumbledore's careful probing revealed glimpses of the darkness that had already taken root in the boy's character, but even the greatest wizard of the age could not fully comprehend the scope of corruption that had grown in the fertile soil of institutional neglect and emotional starvation. Tom's departure from Wool's orphanage marked not the end of his childhood trauma, but its transformation into something far more dangerous. The lessons he had learned about power, manipulation, and the fundamental worthlessness of human life would travel with him to Hogwarts, where access to formal magical education would provide tools for expressing the darkness that had been carefully cultivated in the grey corridors where London's unwanted children learned that the world offered neither love nor mercy to those born without the protection of family or fortune. The orphanage staff who watched him leave experienced a collective sense of relief that none would ever acknowledge openly, though many would find their sleep troubled by dreams of dark eyes that had seen too much and understood too little about what it meant to be human. They could not have imagined that they were witnessing the departure of someone who would grow to threaten not just individual lives, but the entire foundation of the magical world, carrying within him all the concentrated poison of a childhood where love had been absent and cruelty had been the only lesson consistently taught. In the years that followed, Wool's orphanage would continue to house London's forgotten children, but none would ever again possess the particular combination of magical ability, intellectual gifts, and complete emotional emptiness that had made Tom Riddle such a uniquely dangerous presence. The building itself seemed to exhale in relief after his departure, as if even its inanimate stones had sensed the wrongness that had walked its corridors and was grateful to be free of the shadow that had grown within its walls, like a cancer feeding on the despair of the innocent. In the deepest vaults of magical knowledge, hidden among texts that no civilized wizard would dare to study, lies the most abhorrent branch of dark arts ever conceived by human imagination, the creation of Horcruxes, objects that house fragments of a soul deliberately torn through the commission of murder. This magic represents not merely evil but a fundamental violation of the natural order, a corruption so profound that even the most comprehensive magical texts speak of it only in whispers, acknowledging its existence while refusing to provide instruction that might tempt desperate wizards down a path from which there can be no return. The very concept of splitting one's soul challenges every principle upon which magical society has built its understanding of life, death, and the sacred nature of human consciousness. The soul, that ineffable essence that distinguishes living beings from mere animated matter, was never meant to be divided, parceled out like property to be hidden in objects that can be lost, stolen, or destroyed. To attempt such a thing requires not just the commission of murder but the deliberate cultivation of remorse's absence, a hardening of the heart so complete that the act of killing becomes emotionally equivalent to swatting an insect. Horace Slughorn's reluctant explanation of this forbidden magic to the young Tom Riddle reveals the terrible tragedy of how knowledge, even when shared with the best intentions, can become the foundation for unimaginable evil. The old professor, motivated by academic curiosity and perhaps a desire to impress a brilliant student, could never have imagined that his careful, theoretical discussion would provide the roadmap for the most systematic campaign of terror in wizarding history. His words, spoken in the comfortable safety of his office, surrounded by the trappings of civilized learning, became the instruction manual for horrors that would claim thousands of lives. The process itself defies every natural law governing the relationship between body and spirit. Murder, that ultimate violation of another's right to exist, creates a fracture in the killer's soul that normally would heal through genuine remorse and the painful recognition of one's capacity for evil. But the creation of a Horcrux requires that the murderer reject that healing, instead forcing the damaged fragment of soul into an object through rituals so vile that even the darkest texts refuse to record their precise methodology, acknowledging only that they exist and that they extract prices far beyond the simple loss of human life. Tom Riddle's first successful creation of a Horcrux came through the murder of Myrtle Warren, a lonely Hogwarts student whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the young psychopath decided to test both his control over the basilisk and his understanding of the darkest magic. The diary that would house this first fragment of his soul was chosen with characteristic calculation, a simple black journal that would appear innocent to casual observers, while serving as a vessel for the corrupted essence of someone who had chosen to sacrifice another human being for the sake of his own immortality. The physical transformation that accompanied each act of soul-splitting began immediately, though the changes were subtle enough initially that casual observers might attribute them to natural aging or the stress of advanced magical study. Tom's face, which had possessed an almost hypnotic beauty during his school years, began to lose its human warmth, the features becoming more angular and predatory with each murder committed and each fragment of soul torn away. His skin took on a waxy pallor that spoke of something fundamentally wrong with his relationship to life itself, as if the very act of dividing his essence had begun to separate him from the natural world of living beings. The murder of his father and grandparents in Little Hangleton represented not just revenge against those who had abandoned him, but a deliberate embrace of the void where his capacity for love should have resided. The Riddle family died in their drawing room, their faces frozen in expressions of terror that spoke of final moments, filled with recognition that they faced something wearing human form, but possessing no human substance. The ring that bore the resurrection stone, ancient artifact of the Peverell family, became the repository for this second fragment of Tom's soul, chosen because its legendary power would make it irresistible to those who might seek to claim it while remaining ignorant of the curse that would claim their lives. His systematic elimination of potential heirs to Slytherin's legacy continued with the murder of Hepzibah Smith, an elderly collector whose only fault was possessing artifacts that Tom coveted for his dark purposes. The cup that had belonged to Helga Hufflepuff became the vessel for another fragment of his increasingly damaged soul. While poor Hepzibah's house elf was blamed for her mistress's death, a convenience that allowed Tom to escape suspicion while claiming his prize. The ease with which he manipulated both the investigation and public perception demonstrated how completely he had learned to weaponize others' assumptions and prejudices for his own benefit. Each subsequent murder became easier, not through desensitization to violence, but through the systematic erosion of everything that had once connected him to humanity. The young man who had charmed professors and fellow students with his intelligence and apparent warmth was disappearing, replaced by something that wore human appearance while lacking human essence. His laugh became hollow, his smile predatory, his very presence a source of unease that even those who supported him could not entirely ignore or explain. The transformation accelerated as the number of Horcruxes increased. By the time Tom had completed his 7th division of soul, keeping one fragment within his increasingly corrupted body, while placing 6 others in objects of power and significance, he had become something that existed in power, violation of natural law. His appearance shifted beyond the merely unpleasant into the realm of the genuinely monstrous. His features flattened and serpentine, his skin translucent and corpse-like, his very presence a reminder of what happens when the human form becomes merely a vessel for darkness that has consumed everything resembling a human soul. The physical horror of his appearance served as external manifestation of internal corruption that went far deeper than mere aesthetic change. His magical abilities, while enhanced by his willingness to use power without moral constraint, became increasingly unstable as his fragmented soul struggled to maintain connection with a body that was no longer quite alive in any meaningful sense. Spells that should have been simple required enormous effort, while others manifested with unpredictable violence that reflected the chaos within his divided essence. But the true horror of the Horcruxes lay not in their effect on their creator, but in their impact on those unfortunate enough to encounter them. Each object carried within it not just a fragment of Voldemort's soul, but all the malevolence and corruption that had accumulated through decades of systematic evil. They were not merely magical artifacts, but psychological weapons designed to corrupt and destroy anyone who came into prolonged contact with their influence. Ginny Weasley's possession by the diary represents perhaps the most heartbreaking example of how Horcruxes function as instruments of spiritual violation. The 11-year-old girl who opened the innocent-looking journal seeking companionship and understanding found herself gradually consumed by something that fed on her innocence and vitality like a parasite. The fragment of Tom Riddle's soul contained within the diary did not simply influence her actions but began to replace her identity entirely, wearing her body like a costume, while forcing her to commit acts of violence and terror that violated everything she believed about herself. The insidious nature of the diary's influence made resistance nearly impossible, unlike the Imperious Curse, which overwhelmed the victim's will through external force. The Horcrux worked by convincing Ginny that its thoughts were her own, that her growing capacity for cruelty and violence represented natural developments in her character rather than external corruption. She experienced herself making choices to harm other students while simultaneously feeling powerless to prevent those choices, trapped in a nightmare where her own hands moved according to another's will, while her mind watched in helpless horror. The physical toll of serving as a conduit for the diary's malevolence was equally devastating. As Tom Riddle's memory grew stronger by draining her life force, Ginny became increasingly pale and fragile, her vitality flowing into the journal to feed something that had no right to exist in the world of the living. Her family and friends watched her waste away, while remaining ignorant of the cause. their concern and attempts to help only deepening her isolation as she struggled with shame and confusion about changes she could neither understand nor control. The locket's effect on those who wore it demonstrated how Horcruxes could amplify existing psychological vulnerabilities to drive their victims toward despair and self-destruction. Ron Weasley's experience with the cursed jewelry revealed how the fragment of soul contained within could identify and exploit personal insecurities with surgical precision, turning natural human emotions like jealousy and inadequacy into weapons of psychological torture. The locket whispered to him with his own voice, using his deepest fears about his worth and place in the world to construct elaborate scenarios that felt more real than reality itself. It showed him visions of his friend's success and happiness achieved through his absence, convinced him that his presence was not merely unnecessary but actively harmful to those he loved most. The corruption was so subtle and comprehensive that Ron experienced these thoughts as authentic insights into his own unworthiness, rather than external manipulation designed to break his spirit. Harry and Hermione, forced to take turns wearing the cursed object, experienced their own versions of this psychological assault. For Harry, the locket amplified his natural tendency towards self-blame and martyrdom, whispering that every loss and tragedy in his life stemmed from his own failures and inadequacies. For Hermione, it attacked her intellectual confidence and emotional security, suggesting that her knowledge was worthless and her friendships were based on pity rather than genuine affection. The ring that claimed Dumbledore's hand represents perhaps the most sophisticated trap ever created through Horcrux magic. The curse placed upon Marvolo Gaunt's ancient ring was designed not merely to kill but to exploit the fundamental human desire for connection with lost loved ones. The Resurrection Stone's legendary power to summon the spirits of the dead proved irresistible, even to someone as wise and experienced as Dumbledore, demonstrating how Horcruxes could weaponize hope itself as a tool of destruction. The moment Dumbledore slipped the ring onto his finger, seeking to use the stone to speak once more with his sister Ariana, he activated a curse that began consuming his life force with inexorable efficiency. The withering of his hand was merely the visible symptom of spiritual corruption that spread through his magical core like poison, a death sentence that no amount of healing magic could reverse or significantly delay. The tragedy was compounded by the knowledge that his desire to apologize for past failures had been twisted into an instrument of his destruction. The cup hidden in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts demonstrates how Horcruxes could turn even the most secure locations into death traps for the unwary, protected by curses that multiplied any treasure that was touched. The cup ensured that anyone seeking to claim it would be crushed beneath an avalanche of burning metal, their greed literally becoming the instrument of their demise. The goblin magic woven into the vault's defenses proved inadequate against the systematic malevolence that Voldemort had embedded in his chosen hiding place. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Horcrux creation was its demonstration of how evil could become self-sustaining and self-perpetuating. Each fragment of Voldemort's soul retained not just his memories and personality, but his capacity for independent action and thought. The diary Tom, who possessed Ginny, was not merely an echo or shadow of the original, but a fully conscious entity capable of learning, adapting, and pursuing its own version of the Dark Lord's goals. This meant that Voldemort's defeat would not simply eliminate a single threat, but would require the systematic hunting and destruction of multiple versions of himself, each potentially capable of growing into a complete replacement for the original. The fragments existed independently of their creator's physical form, meaning that even his death would not necessarily end the terror he had unleashed upon the world. They were insurance policies against mortality that simultaneously ensured the continued existence of evil long after its originator had passed beyond the reach of earthly justice. The methods required to destroy Horcruxes reflected the fundamental violation of natural law that their creation represented. Ordinary magic proved useless against objects that housed fragments of human soul, protected by the darkest enchantments ever devised. Only forces capable of causing damage beyond the reach of magical healing could hope to unmake what never should have been made in the first place. Basilisk venom, fiend fire, and other destructive powers that carried their own terrible prices for those brave or desperate enough to wield them. The screaming that accompanied each Horcrux's destruction was not merely sound, but the audible manifestation of a soul fragment's violent return to whatever realm awaited the spiritually damned. The anguish contained in those cries spoke to centuries of accumulated evil compressed into objects that had never been meant to house human consciousness. The agony of existence prolonged far beyond natural limits through means that violated every principle of magical and moral law. Ron's destruction of the locket required him to overcome not just his natural reluctance to commit violence, but the psychological warfare that the Horcrux waged against him in its final moments. The visions it projected of his deepest insecurities made manifest were designed to paralyze him with self-doubt, just as he raised the sword to deliver the killing blow. His triumph over these illusions represented not just the destruction of a cursed object, but a personal victory over the fears and inadequacies that had plagued him since childhood. Harry's inadvertent status as a living Horcrux created complications that went far beyond the tactical challenges of hunting cursed objects. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that had attached itself to him during the failed killing curse provided its host with certain advantages: the ability to speak Parseltongue, glimpses into the Dark Lord's thoughts and emotions, while simultaneously serving as a conduit for corruption that threatened to overwhelm his natural goodness through prolonged exposure to absolute evil. The internal struggle between Harry's authentic self and the influence of the soul fragment manifested in moments of rage and cruelty that felt foreign to his normal character, yet seemed to arise from within his own psyche. The possession in the Ministry of Magic revealed how thin the barriers between his identity and Voldemort's had become, how easily the Dark Lord's consciousness could overwhelm his own when circumstances aligned to weaken his psychological defenses. The ultimate revelation that Harry himself was a Horcrux transformed what had seemed like a quest to destroy external objects into a journey towards self-sacrifice that challenged everything he believed about survival and victory. The knowledge that Voldemort could not be truly defeated while a fragment of his soul resided within Harry's own body created an impossible choice between personal survival and the greater good, between the life he wanted to live and the death that justice demanded he accept. His walk into the Forbidden Forest to face Voldemort's killing curse represented the willing destruction of a Horcrux from within, an act of self-sacrifice that reversed the original sin of Horcrux creation by choosing another's welfare over his own survival. The magic that protected him, his mother's sacrifice, and the willing acceptance of death for others' benefit proved stronger than the corruption that had sought to claim his soul, allowing him to survive the destruction of the soul fragment that had never belonged within him. The final Horcrux, Nagini, represented the ultimate perversion of the relationship between wizard and familiar. The great serpent that served as Voldemort's companion and weapon was also the vessel for a fragment of his soul, making her simultaneously pet and phylactery, creature and curse. Her destruction required killing not just a dangerous animal but a living being that housed human consciousness, blurring the lines between murder and necessity in ways that challenged every moral principle governing the treatment of magical creatures. The legacy of the Horcruxes extended far beyond their individual destructions to encompass the psychological damage inflicted upon everyone who had encountered them. Ginny's recovery from her possession required years of healing that went far deeper than magical medicine could reach, addressing trauma that had fundamentally altered her understanding of her own agency and worth. The experience of having her body used as an instrument of violence, while her consciousness remained aware but powerless, left scars that no spell could erase, wounds to the spirit that would require a lifetime of careful tending to prevent them from reopening under stress. The very existence of Horcruxes challenged the wizarding world's understanding of death and the afterlife, suggesting that the natural transition from life to whatever comes next could be indefinitely postponed through sufficient willingness to commit atrocities. This knowledge, once spread beyond the small circle of those who had directly confronted Voldemort's divided soul, raised disturbing questions about whether other dark wizards might attempt similar violations of natural law, whether the techniques of soul-splitting might proliferate among those who valued power over humanity. The destruction of each Horcrux marked not just a tactical victory, but a restoration of natural order that had been violated through Tom Riddle's systematic rejection of everything that made life sacred and meaningful. Their elimination returned stolen fragments of consciousness to whatever judgment awaited souls that had chosen evil so completely, while freeing the objects that had served as their prisons from corruption, that had transformed symbols of achievement and beauty into instruments of spiritual destruction. In the end, the horror of Horcruxes lay not in their magical power, but in what they revealed about the human capacity for self-destruction. In pursuit of impossible dreams, Tom Riddle's quest for immortality through soul-splitting achieved exactly the opposite of its intended goal, transforming him from a young man with unlimited potential into something that existed in violation of life itself, powerful but hollow, enduring but empty, surviving in a state that made death seem like mercy rather than defeat. On a wind-swept island in the North Sea, where the grey waters crash against black rocks with the relentless fury of nature itself, there stands a fortress that embodies humanity's capacity for institutionalized cruelty disguised as justice. Azkaban prison rises from the storm-lashed stone like a monument to despair, its walls built not merely to contain the wizarding world's criminals but to crush their spirits through systematic exposure to horrors that make death seem merciful by comparison. Here, in chambers carved from living rock and perpetually shrouded in mist that tastes of tears and madness, the Ministry of Magic administers punishment that transcends mere imprisonment to become torture refined into policy. The fortress itself seems to have absorbed centuries of suffering into its very foundation, each stone soaked with the accumulated anguish of prisoners who entered as human beings and emerged, if they emerged at all, as hollow shells wearing familiar faces. The architecture speaks to deliberate cruelty in its design. Corridors that echo with the screams of the damned, cells sized to prevent comfort without quite crossing the line into obvious torture, and windows positioned to offer glimpses of freedom that serve only to deepen the prisoner's awareness of their helpless captivity. But the true horror of Azkaban lies not in its physical structure, but in the creatures that have been recruited to serve as its guards. The Dementors that patrol its halls are manifestations of depression given form, beings that feed on happiness and hope, with the systematic efficiency of parasites evolved specifically to drain their hosts of everything that makes existence bearable. Their presence transforms the prison from a place of punishment into something approaching hell itself, where the mere act of breathing becomes an exercise in resisting despair so complete that many prisoners beg for death as a release from torment that seems designed to last for eternity. These spectral guardians glide through the prison's corridors like living embodiments of clinical depression, their hooded forms radiating cold that penetrates not just physical flesh, but the spiritual essence of everyone exposed to their influence. Their very existence near human beings creates an atmosphere of hopelessness so profound that happy memories become impossible to maintain, leaving prisoners trapped in cycles of their worst moments played on endless repeat until madness becomes preferable to consciousness. The ministry's decision to employ such creatures as instruments of law enforcement reveals the depth of corruption that can infect even supposedly civilized institutions when fear and prejudice override basic human decency. Officials who would never personally torture a prisoner find it acceptable to delegate that cruelty to non-human entities, creating a system where the state can inflict suffering that would be recognized as war crimes if applied by individual actors, while maintaining the fiction that they are merely administering appropriate consequences for criminal behavior. The psychological mechanics of Dementor influence represent torture refined to an art form that surpasses anything devised by purely human imagination, rather than simply causing physical pain that the mind might learn to endure or compartmentalize. These creatures attack the victim's capacity for emotional resilience itself, systematically stripping away every psychological defense mechanism that allows people to survive trauma and maintain hope for better circumstances. Prisoners exposed to prolonged Dementor influence experience the gradual erosion of their entire emotional spectrum, beginning with complex feelings like joy and wonder, and progressing through the elimination of basic human responses like love, curiosity, and the simple pleasure of being alive. What remains is raw suffering unmitigated by any capacity to contextualize or transcend the immediate experience of despair, creating a state of existence that makes death appear not as tragedy, but as the ultimate mercy for souls that have been systematically stripped of everything that made life worth living. Sirius Black's 13 years of wrongful imprisonment demonstrate how this systematic torture affects even the strongest personalities when applied with relentless consistency over extended periods. The man who entered Azkaban as James Potter's loyal friend and Harry's loving godfather emerged as something barely recognizable as the person he had been, his sanity preserved only through his ability to transform into his animagus form and thus partially shield his consciousness from the full impact of Dementor influence. Even with this protection, his mental state upon escape reflected the devastating impact of prolonged exposure to institutionalized despair. His emotional responses had become unpredictable and extreme, swinging between desperate affection for those he loved and violent rage toward those he perceived as threats. The man who had once been known for his humor and warmth now carried within him a darkness that no amount of freedom could entirely dispel, scars that went deeper than flesh to mark his very soul, with the imprint of suffering that had been deliberately inflicted by a government that claimed to serve justice. His physical appearance told the story of what 13 years of Dementor exposure could do to human flesh and spirit. The handsome, vital young man who had been wrongfully convicted emerged from Azkaban gaunt and hollow-eyed, his hair prematurely grey, and his skin bearing the pallor of someone who had lived too long in proximity to creatures that drained life itself from the air around them. But the visible changes were merely symptoms of internal damage that had transformed his relationship to existence itself, leaving him capable of love and loyalty, but forever marked by an understanding of despair that colored every subsequent experience. The tragedy of his situation was compounded by the knowledge that his suffering had been entirely preventable, the result of a justice system so corrupted by fear and prejudice that it could condemn an innocent man to torture without bothering to verify the evidence against him. The use of Veritaserum or other forms of magical investigation that could have established his innocence within hours was deemed unnecessary by authorities more concerned with appearing to take decisive action than with ensuring that their decisions were actually just. The case of Barty Crouch Jr. reveals even more disturbing aspects of how Azkaban functions as an instrument of state-sanctioned family destruction. His mother's decision to use Polyjuice Potion to take his place in prison represents the kind of desperate love that parents feel for their children, even when those children have committed unforgivable acts. Yet the system was designed to exploit and corrupt even such pure motivations into instruments of additional suffering. The dying woman who entered Azkaban in her son's place experienced the full horror of Dementor influence without the psychological defenses that might have allowed a guilty person to rationalize their suffering as deserved punishment. Her final weeks were spent in agony that was both physical and spiritual, her body consumed by disease, while her soul was systematically drained of everything that had made her existence meaningful. She died in circumstances that would have horrified even hardened criminals, her sacrifice hidden by bureaucratic secrecy that allowed the system to maintain its facade of appropriate punishment, while actually facilitating cruelties that exceeded anything most prisoners had inflicted upon their victims. Her son's subsequent years of imprisonment under the imperious curse in his father's home created a different but equally disturbing form of torture, demonstrating how the trauma of Azkaban could be replicated and extended through family dynamics corrupted by shame, fear, and the desperate desire to avoid public acknowledgement of personal failure. Barty Sr.'s treatment of his son represented everything toxic about how wizard society dealt with crime and punishment: the preference for private suffering over public justice, the willingness to inflict cruelty in the name of maintaining appearances, and the systematic dehumanization of those designated as beyond redemption. The Dementor's kiss represents perhaps the most horrifying punishment ever devised by any civilization, magical or otherwise. This ultimate sanction goes beyond execution to encompass the complete destruction of the human soul, leaving behind a living body that breathes and moves but contains no consciousness, no personality, no spark of whatever ineffable quality distinguishes sentient beings from mere animated flesh. The victim of the kiss continues to exist in the most technical sense, while being entirely absent from their own life, creating a form of death that is simultaneously absolute and incomplete. The casual way in which ministry officials discuss this fate reveals how thoroughly the wizarding world has normalized cruelties that would be recognized as unconscionable by any moral framework based on respect for human dignity. The kiss is administered not just to those who have committed the most heinous crimes, but to anyone whose continued existence is deemed inconvenient by those in power, making it an instrument of political control disguised as ultimate justice. Barty Crouch Jr.'s fate demonstrates how quickly this ultimate punishment can be administered when it serves the interests of those who prefer to avoid awkward questions or complicated legal proceedings. His administration of the kiss without trial or appeal occurred simply because Cornelius Fudge found his testimony inconvenient and his continued existence politically problematic, showing how easily extraordinary punishments can become routine tools for silencing inconvenient voices. The case of Stan Shumpike illustrates how Azkaban functions as an instrument of political oppression during times of crisis, when governments abandon even the pretense of due process in favor of appearing to take decisive action against threats, both real and imagined. The hapless night bus conductor, whose only crime was making foolish boasts while intoxicated, found himself subjected to the same systematic torture as genuine Death Eaters, his suffering serving no purpose beyond allowing ministry officials to claim they were taking the threat seriously. His imprisonment represents the logical endpoint of systems that value the appearance of security over actual justice, where innocent people become acceptable casualties in political calculations, designed to reassure a frightened public that their government is taking appropriate action. The ease with which he was swept up in mass arrests demonstrates how quickly democratic institutions can be corrupted when fear overrides basic principles of legal protection and human rights. The psychological damage inflicted upon prisoners extends far beyond their individual suffering to affect everyone connected to them through bonds of love, friendship, or family obligation. Spouses and children of Azkaban prisoners experience their own forms of torture as they struggle to maintain relationships with people who have been systematically stripped of their capacity for normal human emotional response. The prison's influence radiates outward through these connections, poisoning entire families and communities with despair that spreads like a contagion from its original source. Neville Longbottom's childhood was shaped by his parents' fate in ways that went far beyond simple orphaning or abandonment. His regular visits to Street Mungo's hospital forced him to confront evidence of what prolonged torture could do to human minds, creating trauma that affected his magical development and social relationships throughout his formative years. The knowledge that his parents existed but could not recognize or respond to him created a particularly cruel form of loss that combined the pain of death with the false hope of continued presence. The medical staff at Street Mungo's who treat the long-term victims of dementor exposure have developed their own forms of psychological damage from prolonged contact with patients whose conditions represent the complete failure of magical healing to address certain forms of trauma. The spell damage ward functions as a repository for the human wreckage created by Azkaban's systematic cruelties, its patients serving as living testimony to the lasting consequences of institutional torture disguised as appropriate punishment. The guards and administrators who work within Azkaban itself represent perhaps the most disturbing aspect of how institutional evil corrupts everyone it touches, even those who believe themselves to be serving legitimate purposes. Extended exposure to Dementor influence affects prison staff almost as severely as it does prisoners, creating a work environment where depression and despair are occupational hazards that gradually erode the mental health of everyone involved in maintaining the system. These workers return home each day, carrying within them the psychic residue of institutional cruelty, their own capacity for happiness, and emotional connection slowly drained through contact with creatures designed to feed on human joy. Their families suffer the secondary effects of this spiritual contamination, creating cycles of depression and dysfunction that spread far beyond the prison walls to infect entire communities with the poison of systematically administered despair. The Ministry's recruitment of new staff for Azkaban positions reveals how readily people can be convinced to participate in systems of torture when that participation is presented as civic duty and professional advancement. Young auras seeking career advancement find themselves assigned to positions that will gradually strip away their humanity, while convincing them that they are serving the greater good through their willingness to work in humanity's defense against criminal threats. The training programs, designed to prepare workers for Azkaban duty, focus on psychological techniques for maintaining emotional distance from prisoner suffering, while developing professional identities based on viewing inmates as less than fully human. These programs succeed in creating staff capable of functioning within the prison environment, but at the cost of transforming ordinary people into individuals whose capacity for empathy has been systematically suppressed in service of institutional needs. The architectural design of Azkaban reflects centuries of refinement in techniques for maximizing psychological pressure while maintaining the appearance of appropriate incarceration rather than obvious torture. The spacing of cells ensures that prisoners can hear each other's suffering without being able to offer comfort or support. The timing of meal delivery and exercise periods is calculated to prevent the development of routines that might provide psychological stability. Even the lighting is designed to create conditions that interfere with natural sleep patterns and circadian rhythms, ensuring that inmates exist in a state of constant low-level disorientation that makes resistance to despair increasingly difficult. The visiting procedures that govern contact between prisoners and their families serve dual purposes of maintaining security while ensuring that even these brief respites from isolation become sources of additional psychological pressure. Visitors must endure exposure to dementia, influence themselves, creating situations where loved ones associate contact with the imprisoned person with their own experiences of supernatural depression and hopelessness. Children who visit imprisoned parents in Azkaban suffer their own forms of trauma from exposure to both the prison environment and the changed personalities of adults they remember as sources of love and security. These visits often become exercises in mutual torture as prisoners struggle to maintain connection with family members, while both parties are subjected to influence designed to make positive emotion impossible to sustain. The long-term societal effects of Azkaban's systematic cruelties extend far beyond the immediate victims to encompass the gradual corruption of wizarding society's understanding of justice, human rights, and appropriate responses to criminal behavior. Generations of citizens have grown up accepting that their government employs creatures of nightmare as instruments of law enforcement, normalizing forms of punishment that would have shocked their ancestors, and creating cultural acceptance for cruelties that corrupt the entire foundation of civilized society. The casual way in which Daily Prophet articles describe Azkaban conditions reveals how thoroughly the wizarding public has been conditioned to accept torture as an appropriate response to crime, viewing prisoner suffering not as a tragic necessity, but as positive evidence that justice is being served. This cultural normalization of cruelty creates conditions where increasingly extreme punishments become acceptable as public fears are manipulated by politicians seeking to demonstrate their commitment to law and order through escalating harshness toward those designated as enemies of society. The escape of Death Eaters during Voldemort's return demonstrates how the apparent security provided by Dementor guards was always illusory, based on the mistaken belief that creatures motivated by hunger for human despair could be relied upon to serve institutional purposes rather than their own feeding requirements. The mass breakout that freed some of the wizarding world's most dangerous criminals occurred not despite Azkaban's supernatural security measures, but because those measures had always prioritized cruelty over actual containment. The political ramifications of these escapes forced temporary acknowledgement that the prison system had failed in its primary function of protecting society from dangerous criminals. Yet, the response focused on increasing security rather than questioning the fundamental appropriateness of employing torture as an instrument of state policy. The discussion centered on practical questions of containment rather than moral questions about whether any government had the right to inflict suffering so systematic and comprehensive that it destroyed prisoners' humanity while corrupting everyone involved in its administration. The eventual removal of Dementors as prison guards represented a tacit admission that their employment had always been more about satisfying public desire for revenge than about actually serving justice or protecting society. Yet this change came only after decades of torture that had destroyed thousands of lives and corrupted an entire civilization's understanding of appropriate punishment, leaving scars that would take generations to heal if they could ever be healed at all. The legacy of Azkaban's horrors continues to influence wizarding society long after its worst practices have been officially abandoned, creating trauma that passes from generation to generation. and maintaining cultural acceptance for forms of punishment that treat human beings as objects whose suffering serves the emotional needs of those who demand vengeance disguised as justice. The fortress itself remains as a monument to humanity's capacity for institutional evil, its empty cells bearing witness to cruelties inflicted by ordinary people who convinced themselves that their victims deserved whatever suffering could be devised for them. In the end, Azkaban represents not just a prison but a test of civilization itself, a measure of how far supposedly decent people will go in pursuit of security and revenge, and how readily they will abandon basic principles of human dignity when fear and hatred are allowed to override compassion and wisdom in shaping the institutions that govern society's response to crime and punishment. In the long corridors of Street Mungo's hospital for magical maladies and injuries, where healers work miracles that would astound Muggle physicians and mend wounds that should have proven fatal, there exists a ward that serves as a monument to the limits of magical medicine and the enduring consequences of evil that transcends physical harm. The Janus Thicky ward for long-term spell damage houses victims whose minds have been so thoroughly shattered by dark magic that no amount of healing can restore what torture has stolen from them, their bodies kept alive while their spirits remain trapped in prisons built from their own traumatized consciousness. Here, among patients whose vacant stares speak of experiences too terrible for human comprehension, Frank and Alice Longbottom spend their days in a twilight existence that cannot properly be called living, yet falls short of the mercy that death might provide. These two brave souls, who once stood among the most promising auras of their generation, now serve as living testimony to the particular cruelty that Bellatrix Lestrange and her associates perfected through their systematic application of the Cruciatus Curse over hours that stretched into an eternity of agony. The couple who had fought with such courage during the First War against Voldemort, who had thrice defied the Dark Lord and survived encounters that claimed the lives of lesser wizards, found themselves facing an enemy whose sadism exceeded anything they had encountered during their most dangerous missions. The attack that destroyed their minds occurred not in the heat of battle, where death might have come swiftly and with honor, but in the calculated intimacy of torture, conducted by people who had once moved in the same social circles, who understood exactly what they were destroying when they chose to break two of the finest people their generation had produced. Bellatrix Lestrange approached the torture of the Longbottoms with the same passionate intensity that she brought to her worship of Lord Voldemort, viewing their suffering not as a means to extract information, but as an offering to her dark master and a source of personal pleasure that fed something twisted and hungry within her own damaged psyche. Her laughter during the extended torture sessions was not the sound of someone losing their sanity, but of someone whose sanity had been deliberately replaced by a joy in causing pain that transcended any rational purpose or strategic objective. The Cruciatus Curse, when applied with the malevolent expertise that Bellatrix had developed through years of practice on prisoners who could not fight back, became something far more devastating than the simple pain curse that most wizards understood it to be. In her hands, guided by genuine hatred and a sophisticated understanding of how psychological pressure could amplify physical agony, it became an instrument capable of reaching into the deepest recesses of human consciousness and systematically destroying everything that made personality possible. The curse worked by overwhelming the victim's nervous system with pain so intense that rational thought became impossible. But Bellatrix's particular refinement lay in her ability to modulate the intensity and focus of that pain to maintain her victims on the precise edge between unconsciousness and awareness. She kept Frank and Alice conscious throughout their ordeal, ensuring that they experienced every moment of their destruction, while being unable to retreat into the merciful oblivion that might have protected their minds from complete annihilation. Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange, along with Barty Crouch Jr., served as eager assistants in this exercise in systematic cruelty, their own casting of the unforgivable curse, adding layers of agony that prevented either victim from developing any tolerance or psychological defense against the assault on their consciousness. The four Death Eaters worked with the coordination of musicians in some hellish orchestra, their timing and intensity carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum psychological destruction, while keeping their victims alive and aware enough to experience every moment of their metamorphosis from human beings into hollow shells. The information they claimed to be seeking, the whereabouts of Lord Voldemort following his apparent defeat, was almost certainly unknown to their victims, making the torture not an interrogation but a celebration of evil for its own sake. Frank and Alice Longbottom were chosen not because they possessed crucial intelligence, but because they represented everything the Death Eaters despised about auror dedication and moral courage. Their destruction served as both revenge against those who had opposed Voldemort, and a demonstration of what awaited anyone foolish enough to believe that good could triumph over evil. The particular tragedy of their case lay in the timing of the attack, occurring after Voldemort's apparent defeat, when they should have been able to celebrate victory and begin building the peaceful lives they had fought to protect. Instead, their moment of triumph became the prelude to a horror that would consume not just their own existence, but cast a shadow over their infant son's entire childhood and adolescence. Baby Neville, who survived the attack only because he was not present when the Death Eaters came calling, became an orphan in the cruelest possible way. His parents lived on, but the people who had loved him and planned his future were gone as surely as if they had been murdered, replaced by strangers who wore familiar faces while possessing no memory of the child they had once cherished above all else. The continuation of their biological functions served only to make his loss more painful, offering the illusion of family while denying him any of the substance that family relationships require. Augusta Longbottom, Frank's mother, found herself thrust into the role of primary caregiver for a traumatized infant, while simultaneously dealing with her own grief over what had been done to her son and daughter-in-law. The proud woman who had raised Frank to be a hero watched helplessly as he failed to recognize her face or respond to her voice, his eyes holding no trace of the loving son who had brought honor to the Longbottom name through his service to the wizarding world, her strength in maintaining regular visits to Street Mungo's while raising Neville created a routine built around hope that reason suggested was futile, yet she persisted in treating Frank and Alice as if they might one day return to themselves, rather than accepting that the people she had known were gone forever. Her determination to expose Neville to his parents, despite their inability to recognize or respond to him, reflected both love and a kind of stubborn denial that the torture had been as complete as the evidence clearly indicated. The Christmas visits that became tradition in the Longbottom family represent perhaps the most heartbreaking ritual in all of wizarding society, a ceremony that combines love with futility in proportions that would break the hearts of casual observers who understood what they were witnessing. Augusta would dress both herself and Neville in their finest clothes, preparing for these visits as if they were genuine family celebrations, rather than exercises in one-sided devotion to people who existed physically but had been spiritually murdered years before. Alice's gift of empty sweet wrappers to her son crystallizes everything tragic about their situation in a single gesture that simultaneously demonstrates her complete disconnection from reality and the faint echo of maternal love that somehow survives even the most comprehensive destruction of personality and memory. The candy wrappers, worthless scraps of colorful paper that she presents with the solemn ceremony of someone offering precious gifts, represent all that remains of a mother's desire to give her child something special during their brief moments together. Neville's acceptance of these meaningless offerings, his quiet, "Thanks, Mum," spoken to a woman who cannot understand the words or recognize the relationship they represent, reveals the depth of his own psychological adaptation to circumstances that no child should have to endure. His politeness in the face of such obvious mental absence reflects both good upbringing and the kind of emotional sophistication that trauma can force upon young minds, teaching them to find meaning and connection even in situations that offer neither. The other patients in the Janus Thicky ward serve as a Greek chorus of mental destruction, their various forms of spell damage, creating an environment where the Longbottom's condition appears almost normal by comparison. The wizard who believes himself to be a teapot, the witch whose memories have been so thoroughly scrambled that she lives each day as if encountering the world for the first time, the former Auror, who can speak only in questions. Each represents a different method by which dark magic can unmake human consciousness while leaving the body intact. The healers who work in this ward have developed their own mechanisms for coping with daily exposure to the limits of their profession's ability to help those who have been damaged beyond the reach of conventional magical medicine. Their cheerful bedside manner, maintained despite the obvious futility of their efforts, reflects both professional training and psychological necessity, the need to find purpose and meaning in work that daily confronts them with evidence of their own ultimate powerlessness against certain forms of evil. The families who visit these patients create their own support networks based on shared understanding of losses that the outside world cannot fully comprehend. They have learned to find comfort in small gestures and momentary connections that might seem pathetically inadequate to those who have never had to redefine their expectations of what relationships with loved ones can provide. Their conversations in the hospital waiting areas reveal the particular vocabulary that develops around hope, deferred indefinitely, and love maintained without reciprocation. Neville's development throughout his childhood was inevitably shaped by these regular encounters with the devastating consequences of standing up to evil, though he processed these lessons in ways that his grandmother could never have anticipated. Rather than being discouraged from following his parents' example of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, he internalized their sacrifice as a standard he needed to meet, rather than a cautionary tale about the prices that heroism could demand. His magical development was slower than his peers, not from lack of ability, but from the psychological pressure of growing up in the shadow of parents whose own exceptional talents had ultimately proven insufficient to protect them from the consequences of their choices. The knowledge that Frank and Alice Longbottom had been among the most promising auras of their generation created expectations that Neville struggled to meet, while simultaneously wondering whether such achievements were worth pursuing, given what they had ultimately cost his family. The bullying he endured at school was made more painful by his awareness that his parents could not provide the emotional support that might have helped him develop confidence and resilience in the face of such treatment. While other children could return home to families who would comfort them and help them process difficult experiences, Neville faced his challenges essentially alone, despite being surrounded by people who cared about his welfare. His relationship with his grandmother was complicated by her own grief and the impossible position of trying to be both stern disciplinarian and nurturing caregiver while dealing with her own trauma over what had happened to her son. Augusta's high standards and traditional values, which had served Frank well during his development, sometimes proved counterproductive when applied to a boy whose confidence had been undermined by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The prophecy that might have applied to Neville instead of Harry Potter adds another layer of tragedy to his family's story. suggesting that the attack on the Longbottoms might have been motivated by Voldemort's desire to eliminate a potential threat rather than simple revenge against Auror activity. This possibility, while never definitively confirmed, raises questions about whether Frank and Alice's torture served strategic purposes beyond the Death Eater's obvious enjoyment of causing suffering to those who had opposed their master. The guilt that some Order members felt about the Longbottoms' fate reflects the impossible moral calculations that war forces upon even the most ethical people. Should they have provided better protection for families of known Aurors? Was there information they could have shared that might have prevented the attack? Could different tactical decisions have spared the Longbottoms while achieving the same strategic objectives? These questions have no satisfactory answers. Yet they continue to haunt those who survived the conflict while watching good people pay prices that seem disproportionate to anything they might have done to deserve such fates. The medical research conducted on long-term spell damage cases like the Longbottoms has advanced understanding of how dark magic affects human consciousness, but this knowledge comes at the cost of treating suffering people as subjects for study rather than patients deserving care and dignity. The ethical questions raised by such research, whether it is acceptable to experiment on people who cannot give informed consent, how to balance the pursuit of knowledge against respect for patient welfare, reflect broader issues about how magical society deals with those who have been damaged beyond conventional healing. The financial burden of long-term care at Street Mungos represents another dimension of how the consequences of war extend far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire family structures and economic situations. The Longbottom family's wealth allowed them to provide the best possible care for Frank and Alice, but similar attacks on less affluent families might have resulted in even worse outcomes, as resources became strained over years of expensive treatment with no prospect of recovery. The social isolation that families of long-term spell damage patients experience reflects the broader wizarding world's discomfort with evidence of magic's capacity to cause irreversible harm to good people who did nothing to deserve their fates. Friends and acquaintances often drift away when confronted with suffering that cannot be fixed or explained away, leaving families to cope with their losses while also dealing with the gradual erosion of their social support networks. Augusta's fierce protection of her family's dignity in the face of such circumstances required constant vigilance against those who might exploit their tragedy for political or personal gain. The Daily Prophet's occasional attempts to feature the Longbottoms as symbols of Death Eater brutality had to be carefully managed to prevent their private suffering from becoming public spectacle, while still allowing their sacrifice to serve as testimony to the reality of what the wizarding world had faced during Voldemort's reign of terror. The impact of the Longbottoms' fate on Auror recruitment and training programs illustrates how individual tragedies can influence institutional policies and professional cultures. New Aurors entering the service after the First War were trained with full awareness of what had happened to Frank and Alice, creating a generation of law enforcement officers who understood from the beginning that their career choices carried risks that extended beyond personal death to encompass fates that might be worse than dying. The gradual revelation of Neville's own courage and magical ability throughout his Hogwarts years served as vindication of his parents' legacy, while also demonstrating how trauma and disadvantage do not necessarily prevent individuals from achieving greatness when circumstances allow their true nature to emerge. His evolution from frightened child to capable young wizard proved that Frank and Alice's sacrifice had not been entirely in vain, as their son inherited their capacity for standing up to evil despite understanding better than most what such stands could cost. The Battle of Hogwarts, where Neville's courage reached its full expression in his defiance of Voldemort and his destruction of the final Horcrux, represented a form of redemption for his family's suffering. His willingness to face death, rather than submit to evil, demonstrated that the values Frank and Alice had died defending lived on in their son, transformed by his own experiences, but recognizable as the same commitment to justice and protection of innocence that had motivated their original sacrifice. The empty candy wrappers that Alice continues to offer, decades after their original exchange, serve as a reminder that love can survive even the most comprehensive destruction of personality and memory. While she cannot recognize her son or understand their relationship, some deeper instinct continues to drive her toward gestures of giving that echo the maternal devotion that once made her willing to face torture rather than betray those she was sworn to protect. In the end, the tragedy of Frank and Alice Longbottom represents not just the story of two individuals destroyed by evil, but a meditation on how love and duty can persist even when everything that makes them meaningful has been stripped away by forces that recognize no limits in their pursuit of power and pleasure through the suffering of others. In the shadowed corners of wizarding society, where ancient pure-blood families nurse grievances that fester across generations and ordinary citizens find themselves seduced by promises of power and belonging, there exists a phenomenon that transcends simple criminal organization to become something approaching religious cult. The Death Eaters represent the darkest expression of magical supremacist ideology, their ranks filled not merely with sadistic criminals seeking license for violence, but with intelligent, educated wizards who have chosen to surrender their individual humanity in service to a leader whose charisma masks appetites that can never be satisfied through conventional conquest or political victory. The dark mark that brands each follower serves as both symbol and magical binding, a tattoo that burns black against pale flesh while creating connections between bearer and master that transcend normal human relationships. This is not mere identification, but a form of spiritual enslavement disguised as honor, each mark representing a soul voluntarily surrendered to someone whose own fragmented essence has been scattered across objects hidden throughout the wizarding world. The pain that accompanies the mark's activation becomes a source of perverse pleasure for those who have learned to interpret their master's summons as validation of their chosen identity, rather than evidence of their systematic dehumanization. The ritual that creates each Death Eater involves more than simple oath-taking or ceremonial initiation, but represents a deliberate choice to abandon individual moral agency in favor of collective identity based on hatred, fear, and the intoxicating promise of power over those designated as inferior. Voldemort's recruitment methods demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human psychology as he identifies potential followers not through their existing evil, but through their vulnerabilities, their fears of inadequacy, their resentment over perceived slights, their desperate hunger for significance in a world that has failed to recognize their imagined superiority. The ceremony itself takes place in environments designed to overwhelm rational thought through combination of supernatural terror and ritualized submission that strips participants of the psychological defenses that might allow them to reconsider their choices. Candlelit chambers filled with the skulls of muggles and blood traitors create atmosphere where normal moral reasoning becomes impossible, while the presence of Voldemort himself, radiating malevolence so pure that it seems to poison the very air, makes resistance feel not just futile but actively self-destructive. New initiates find themselves surrounded by hooded figures whose anonymity serves the dual purpose of protecting their identities while creating the impression that they are joining something larger than individual human ambition. The masks that Death Eaters wear during operations serve psychological functions beyond mere concealment, allowing wearers to temporarily abandon their civilian identities and embrace personas dedicated entirely to serving their master's will without the complications that individual personality and moral conscience might otherwise create. The psychology of willing submission to absolute evil reveals disturbing truths about how ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of systematic cruelty when their natural empathy is systematically eroded through exposure to ideology that dehumanizes selected populations, while elevating the chosen group's sense of superiority and entitlement. Death Eaters are not born but made, created through processes that identify and exploit existing character weaknesses until compassion becomes impossible and cruelty becomes not just acceptable but actively pleasurable. Lucius Malfoy's transformation from aristocratic pure-blood supremacist to cowering servant illustrates how the promise of enhanced status and power can seduce even those who possess wealth and social position beyond most wizards' dreams. His initial attraction to Voldemort's movement was based on the belief that joining the winning side early would cement his family's position at the apex of a new social order, where pure-blood superiority would be enforced through law rather than maintained through subtle discrimination and economic advantage. The reality of service to the Dark Lord proved far different from his elegant fantasies of refined supremacism implemented through civilized channels. Instead of becoming a valued advisor whose opinions would shape policy and whose family would benefit from association with ultimate power, he found himself reduced to the status of expendable tool, whose value lay entirely in his willingness to perform whatever tasks his master demanded, without question or hesitation. The systematic humiliation that Voldemort inflicted upon his followers served multiple purposes beyond simple sadistic pleasure, though that element was certainly present in his treatment of those who had chosen to worship him. Each act of degradation reinforced the power dynamic that kept Death Eaters psychologically dependent on their master's approval, while simultaneously demonstrating to potential recruits that joining his cause required complete surrender of personal dignity and individual will. The use of Malfoy Manor as headquarters for Death Eater operations transformed the family's ancestral home from symbol of pure blood pride into a theater for horrors that violated every principle of hospitality and civilized behavior that had governed aristocratic society for centuries. The dining room where the Malfoys had once entertained the cream of wizarding society became the setting for torture sessions and executions conducted for the entertainment of guests whose presence had once been considered an honor. The particular cruelty of forcing Lucius and Narcissa to witness these violations of their personal space while maintaining facades of willing cooperation demonstrates how thoroughly Voldemort understood the psychology of those he claimed to serve. Their visible distress at seeing their home defiled only increased his pleasure in the degradation as he fed on their helpless rage, while they maintained the pretense that his presence was welcome, rather than imposed through terror and magical compulsion. Peter Pettigrew's journey from loyal friend to treacherous servant represents perhaps the most psychologically complex transformation among Voldemort's followers, as his betrayal of the Potters required him to overcome not just abstract moral principles but genuine personal affection and years of shared experience with those he condemned to death. His case demonstrates how fear can corrupt even loving relationships when self-preservation conflicts with loyalty and courage, proves insufficient to overcome the terror of facing consequences that seem worse than any guilt that betrayal might produce. His recruitment occurred not through ideological seduction, but through recognition of his fundamental cowardice and the calculation that preserving his own life justified any betrayal of those who had treated him as family. Voldemort's approach to Pettigrew revealed sophisticated understanding of how different personality types required different forms of manipulation, where others might be seduced by promises of power or appeals to prejudice, Peter required only the simple choice between betraying his friends and facing death himself. The magical compulsion that transformed him into his animagus form whenever stress became overwhelming served as external manifestation of internal collapse that had occurred when he chose survival over loyalty. His rat form became both refuge from human responsibility and symbol of what he had allowed himself to become through decisions that prioritized personal safety over everything that had previously given his life meaning and purpose. The Carrow siblings' appointment as professors at Hogwarts represents the systematic corruption of educational institutions that occurs when totalitarian movements gain sufficient power to implement their ideological programs through official channels. Their transformation of defense against the dark arts into instruction in the dark arts themselves demonstrated how quickly academic freedom can be perverted into indoctrination when those in authority positions prioritize political loyalty over educational integrity or student welfare. Their use of the Cruciatus Curse as disciplinary tool reveals how easily violence can become normalized within institutional settings when those who might object are removed or silenced through intimidation. Students who had once felt safe within Hogwarts walls found themselves subjected to tortures that would have been criminal if applied by individual actors, but became policy when administered by those claiming governmental authority. The psychology of systematic cruelty requires practitioners to develop emotional distance from their victims' suffering, while maintaining conviction that their actions serve purposes important enough to justify whatever pain they inflict. The Carrows achieved this psychological state through ideological training that taught them to view students from non-pure blood families as inherently inferior beings whose suffering mattered less than the political objectives their punishment was designed to serve. The recruitment methods that Death Eater leadership employed during their period of governmental control demonstrate how totalitarian movements exploit existing social divisions and economic pressures to build support among populations that might otherwise resist their message. Families facing financial hardship were offered opportunities for advancement in exchange for cooperation with new policies, while those whose businesses depended on government contracts found themselves forced to choose between their principles and their livelihoods. The Muggle-born Registration Commission that operated from within the Ministry of Magic represents the bureaucratization of genocide, the transformation of systematic persecution from crude violence into administrative procedure carried out by civil servants who could maintain psychological distance from the ultimate consequences of their paperwork. The clerks who processed cases that would determine whether individuals lived or died were able to participate in mass murder while telling themselves they were simply following proper procedures and maintaining accurate records. This administrative approach to ethnic cleansing served the dual purpose of maximizing efficiency while minimizing the psychological cost to those implementing the policy. Rather than requiring Death Eaters to personally murder every Muggle-born wizard they encountered, the system created legal frameworks that made such killings appear justified while distributing responsibility among so many participants that no individual felt entirely responsible for the ultimate outcomes. Their collective actions produced the propaganda campaign that accompanied these policy changes, reveals sophisticated understanding of how public opinion can be manipulated through careful presentation of information that appears factual while serving ideological purposes. The Daily Prophet's transformation from independent news source into Death Eater mouthpiece demonstrates how quickly journalistic institutions can be corrupted when survival requires cooperation with those who control both access to information and the physical safety of reporters and editors. The articles that appeared during this period combined factual reporting with subtle editorial slants that gradually shifted public perception of events while maintaining the appearance of objective journalism. Readers who relied on the profit for information found themselves gradually accepting premises that they might have questioned if presented more directly, as the psychological techniques of propaganda worked to reshape their understanding of reality through repetition and emotional manipulation, rather than direct argument. The resistance movements that emerged in response to Death Eater control demonstrate both the resilience of human decency under extreme pressure and the terrible costs that opposition exacts from those brave enough to maintain their principles when doing so requires risking everything they value. The students who formed Dumbledore's army and later participated in underground resistance activities understood that their choices might result in torture, death, or fates worse than either, yet they chose to act anyway, because submission to evil felt like a betrayal of everything that gave their lives meaning. The psychological pressure that resistance members experienced required them to constantly evaluate whether their actions justified the risks they imposed, not just on themselves but on their families and friends. Every act of defiance created potential consequences for innocent people who might be punished for their relatives' or associates' choices, creating moral complexities that had no clear resolution and required individuals to make decisions based on incomplete information about consequences that might not become apparent for months or years. The torture sessions that served as both punishment for captured resistance members and entertainment for Death Eater gatherings reveal the particular pleasure that some individuals derive from exercising absolute power over helpless victims. These events were not simply interrogations designed to extract information, but ritualized celebrations of cruelty that served to reinforce group cohesion among Death Eaters while satisfying appetites for domination that could never be satisfied through conventional forms of social interaction. The audience participation that characterized these sessions created collective responsibility for individual acts of torture, while providing psychological validation for those who might otherwise have questioned their involvement in systematic cruelty. When everyone present was required to participate in or witness torture, the shared guilt became a form of bonding that made later defection psychologically difficult and practically dangerous. The magical techniques that Death Eaters developed for maximizing psychological pressure while maintaining their victims' consciousness represent refinements of torture methods that push the boundaries of what human minds can endure without permanent damage. The Cruciatus Curse, when applied with the skill and creativity that advanced practitioners developed, could be modulated to create different forms of agony that served different psychological purposes. Sharp pain that demanded immediate attention, dull aches that persisted for hours after the curse ended, or burning sensations that felt like being consumed by fire while leaving no physical evidence of injury. The memory modification techniques that Death Eaters employed to cover their tracks and manipulate witnesses demonstrate how magical abilities can be perverted into tools for eliminating accountability and creating confusion about events that might otherwise provide evidence of criminal activity. These modifications went beyond simple memory erasure to include implantation of false memories that would mislead investigators while creating psychological trauma in victims who found themselves unable to trust their own perceptions of reality. The children who grew up in Death Eater families during this period experienced forms of indoctrination that combined parental authority with ideological training to create young people whose capacity for independent moral reasoning was systematically undermined from their earliest years. Draco Malfoy's evolution from privileged child parroting his parents' prejudices to reluctant participant in activities that violated his fundamental decency demonstrates how family pressure and social expectation can override individual conscience when the costs of resistance seem too high to bear. His assignment to murder Dumbledore represented Voldemort's understanding that the most effective way to ensure loyalty among his followers was to require them to commit acts that made retreat from his service psychologically impossible. Once Draco had attempted murder, even unsuccessfully, he could no longer maintain the fiction that he was merely associated with Death Eaters rather than being one himself, creating psychological investment in the movement's success that went beyond ideology to encompass personal survival. The systematic degradation of captured enemies through public torture and execution served multiple functions within Death Eater psychology, providing outlets for sadistic impulses, while creating shared experiences that bonded group members through collective participation in activities that violated fundamental human decency. These events were not spontaneous expressions of anger or revenge, but carefully orchestrated rituals designed to transform ordinary people into instruments of systematic evil through gradual exposure to increasingly extreme forms of violence. The escalation that characterized these sessions reveals how participation in collective cruelty creates psychological momentum that pushes participants toward ever greater extremes of behavior as previous actions create investment in the end. Group identity that makes retreat seem like betrayal of both ideology and personal history. Each act of violence made the next one easier to justify and harder to resist, creating cycles of brutalization that transformed even reluctant participants into enthusiastic collaborators over time. The family dynamics that developed within Death Eater households demonstrate how totalitarian ideology corrupts the most intimate human relationships by requiring parents to choose between their children's welfare and their political commitments. The Malfoy family's visible stress during the period when their home served as Death Eater headquarters reveals how completely such movements invade private space and personal relationships, making normal family life impossible. When political loyalty requires constant performance of enthusiasm for policies that violate basic parental instincts. The ultimate collapse of the Death Eater movement following Voldemort's final defeat demonstrates how movements based on fear and hatred contain the seeds of their own destruction, as the psychological techniques that create short-term loyalty prove insufficient to maintain cohesion when the charismatic leader who provided focus for collective identity is removed from the equation. Without Voldemort's unifying presence, Death Eaters found themselves confronting the reality of what they had become and done, facing individual responsibility for choices they had made while believing themselves part of something larger than personal ambition or prejudice. The trials that followed revealed how quickly former Death Eaters distanced themselves from their previous associations when survival required renunciation of beliefs they had once claimed to hold above life itself. Their testimony against former colleagues demonstrated how shallow their ideological commitment had actually been, serving primarily as justification for behavior that served psychological needs rather than principled political positions. In the marble corridors of the Ministry of Magic, where bronze fountains celebrate the supposed harmony between magical and non-magical beings, and golden elevators carry civil servants between departments, dedicated to maintaining the delicate balance of wizarding society, there festered a corruption so profound that it transformed the very institution meant to protect magical Britain into the primary instrument of its oppression. The ministry's descent into institutional evil represents not the sudden conquest of good government by external forces, but the gradual erosion of democratic principles through fear, ambition, and the willingness of ordinary bureaucrats to sacrifice justice for the illusion of security and personal advancement. Cornelius Fudge's tenure as Minister for Magic demonstrates how democratic leaders can become instruments of tyranny not through malicious intent, but through cowardice disguised as pragmatism and the desperate desire to maintain power, even when that power serves only to enable greater evils. His refusal to acknowledge Voldemort's return was not born from ignorance or stupidity, but from the calculated understanding that admitting the truth would require actions that might threaten his political survival and force him to confront realities that his comfortable worldview could not accommodate. The systematic campaign to discredit Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore reveals how easily democratic institutions can be weaponized against those who threaten official narratives, even when those narratives serve only to protect political careers rather than public welfare. The Daily Prophet's transformation into a propaganda outlet required no direct government takeover, but merely the application of economic pressure and access restrictions that made independent journalism financially unsustainable for publications that refused to cooperate with official policy. The character assassination conducted against Harry Potter demonstrates the sophisticated techniques that modern governments employ to destroy inconvenient voices without resorting to obvious censorship or physical violence. Rather than simply silencing him, the ministry chose to systematically undermine his credibility through careful presentation of information that made his warnings appear to be the products of attention-seeking behavior or psychological instability, rather than accurate assessments of genuine threats. The bureaucratic machinery that enabled this campaign required the cooperation of civil servants throughout the ministry hierarchy, from senior officials who crafted policy to junior clerks who processed the paperwork that implemented character destruction through official channels. Each participant could maintain psychological distance from the ultimate consequences of their actions by focusing on their specific administrative responsibilities while ignoring the broader context that gave their individual tasks meaning and purpose. Dolores Umbridge's appointment as High Inquisitor at Hogwarts represents the systematic corruption of educational institutions that occurs when political loyalty becomes more important than professional competence or student welfare. Her background as a ministry bureaucrat with no teaching experience should have disqualified her from any position involving direct contact with children, yet her willingness to implement government policy without question made her the perfect instrument for transforming Hogwarts from a center of learning into a laboratory for authoritarian control techniques. Her teaching methods reveal how quickly educational environments can be perverted into indoctrination centers when administrators prioritize political compliance over academic integrity. The defense against the dark arts curriculum that she implemented was designed not to prepare students for real-world threats, but to create passive citizens who would accept government authority without question and rely on official channels for protection rather than developing the independent judgment that might lead them to challenge institutional decisions. The systematic torture that she inflicted upon students through the Black Quill demonstrates how bureaucratic sadism can flourish within institutional frameworks that provide legal cover for activities that would be recognized as criminal if conducted by private individuals. Her pleasure in watching students carve words into their own flesh was not aberrant behavior, but the logical extension of authoritarian ideology that views dissent as deserving punishment and pain as an appropriate tool for ensuring compliance. The blood ink that flowed from students' hands as they wrote lines with her cursed quill served dual purposes of creating physical evidence of the punishment, while ensuring that the victims participated in their own torture, making resistance psychologically more difficult and compliance appear to be voluntary choice rather than coerced submission. The scars that remained after the immediate wounds healed served as permanent reminders of what awaited those who challenged official authority or expressed opinions that contradicted approved doctrine. Her expansion of authority through educational decree after educational decree illustrates how emergency powers can be used to systematically dismantle democratic protections while maintaining the appearance of legal procedure and proper governmental process. Each new restriction on student behavior was presented as necessary response to specific problems, creating the impression that the administration was addressing legitimate concerns rather than implementing comprehensive surveillance and control systems designed to eliminate any possibility of organized resistance. The inquisitorial squad that she created from Slytherin students demonstrates how authoritarian systems recruit collaborators from among the governed population by offering privileges and power to those willing to betray their peers in service to institutional authority. These student enforcers provided her with intelligence about activities that adult supervision could not detect, while creating social divisions that made unified resistance more difficult to organize and maintain. The casual cruelty that characterized squad operations reveals how quickly ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of oppression when given official sanction for behavior that would normally be constrained by social norms and legal restrictions. Students who had previously been mere bullies found themselves elevated to positions of real authority with the power to impose serious consequences on those they disliked, creating situations where personal grievances became matters of political significance and school discipline became indistinguishable from political persecution. The ministry's takeover by Death Eaters following Scrimgeour's assassination demonstrates how democratic institutions can be captured by extremist movements, not through violent revolution, but through the systematic placement of loyal operatives in key positions where they can influence policy and personnel decisions. The transition from Fudge's willful denial to Scrimgeour's authoritarian overreach to Thickness's puppet regime shows how each stage of democratic collapse creates conditions that enable the next level of institutional corruption. The Muggle-born Registration Commission that operated from within the ministry represents the bureaucratization of genocide, transforming systematic persecution from crude violence into administrative procedure that allowed participants to maintain psychological distance from the ultimate consequences of their actions. The clerks who processed registration forms and conducted hearings could tell themselves they were following proper legal procedures while implementing policies designed to identify targets for imprisonment, torture, and murder. The propaganda techniques employed during this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how public opinion can be manipulated through careful presentation of information that appears factual while serving ideological purposes. The Daily Prophet's coverage of commission activities used language that made persecution appear to be legitimate law enforcement, describing victims as criminals and presenting their suffering as appropriate consequences for violations of natural order, rather than arbitrary cruelty inflicted for political purposes. The transformation of the atrium's fountain from celebration of interspecies cooperation to monument of wizarding supremacy illustrates how totalitarian movements use symbolic changes to normalize ideological transformation, while creating visible reminders of new power, relationships. The golden figures of wizards standing triumphant over cowering muggles and magical creatures served both as artistic expression of official policy and psychological conditioning that reinforced hierarchical thinking in everyone who passed through the ministry's public spaces. The security measures implemented during this period created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that made normal social interaction impossible, while ensuring that potential dissidents understood they were being watched and evaluated for signs of disloyalty. The mandatory wand registration that accompanied these policies served the dual purpose of monitoring magical activity while creating databases that could be used to track individuals whose behavior suggested they might pose threats to the new regime. The trials conducted during the Commission's operations reveal how legal procedures can be perverted into instruments of predetermined persecution, while maintaining facades of due process that provide psychological comfort to those implementing unjust policies. The defendants who appeared before these tribunals faced charges that were impossible to defend against because the evidence required for acquittal, proof of magical inheritance from wizard ancestors, was deliberately defined in ways that made it unavailable to most Muggle-born individuals regardless of their actual magical abilities. The interrogation techniques employed during these proceedings went beyond simple questioning to include psychological pressure designed to break down defendants' resistance to confession and cooperation with investigations targeting other Muggle-born wizards. The Commission's operators understood that forced confessions served propaganda purposes beyond their legal significance, providing evidence that could be used to justify expanded persecution, while creating testimonies that implicated additional victims in fabricated conspiracies against wizarding society. The economic policies that accompanied political persecution demonstrate how totalitarian movements use financial pressure to enforce compliance among populations that might otherwise resist ideological demands. Muggle-born wizards found themselves excluded from employment opportunities, while their assets were subject to confiscation under laws that made their continued economic survival dependent on cooperation with registration requirements that many understood were preludes to more severe persecution. The businesses that cooperated with these policies by refusing service to registered individuals or reporting suspicious activity to authorities were rewarded with government contracts and preferential treatment that created economic incentives for collaboration with systematic discrimination. The shop owners and service providers who participated in this economic warfare could tell themselves they were protecting their employees and customers, while actually serving as instruments of persecution against innocent people whose only crime was their parentage. The resistance movements that emerged within the ministry itself demonstrate both the resilience of individual conscience under extreme institutional pressure and the terrible personal costs that maintaining moral principles can exact from those who choose to act on their convictions rather than submit to corrupt authority. The Order of the Phoenix members who maintained their positions within the government while secretly working to undermine Death Eater policies faced daily choices between personal safety and moral obligation that required extraordinary courage and psychological strength. Arthur Weasley's continued service during this period exemplifies the moral complexities that resistance workers faced as they attempted to maintain their cover while gathering intelligence and protecting potential victims. His work in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office provided opportunities to monitor Death Eater activities, while his reputation as an eccentric bureaucrat with harmless obsessions helped deflect suspicion from his actual political sympathies and clandestine activities. The information networks that developed among ministry employees, opposed to Death Eater control, demonstrate how institutional knowledge and personal relationships can be weaponized against corrupt authorities by those who understand governmental systems well enough to exploit their vulnerabilities. These networks provided early warning about planned arrests and policy changes, while creating channels through which intelligence could flow to resistance organizations operating outside official channels. The psychological toll that maintaining such double lives extracted from resistance workers reveals how prolonged exposure to institutional evil affects even those who actively oppose it, creating stress that manifests in physical illness, relationship problems, and psychological symptoms that persist long after the immediate danger has passed. The necessity of maintaining normal appearances while witnessing daily atrocities created forms of complicity that troubled even committed opponents of the regime, as their continued participation in governmental operations provided legitimacy for institutions they were working to undermine. The purges that eventually targeted ministry employees suspected of insufficient loyalty demonstrate how paranoid governments inevitably turn against their own supporters when fear and suspicion replace rational assessment of actual threats. The escalating demands for demonstrations of ideological commitment created situations where even enthusiastic collaborators found themselves subject to scrutiny that could result in imprisonment, or worse, based on accusations that were impossible to disprove or adequately address. The show trials that accompanied these purges served multiple purposes beyond eliminating specific individuals, creating public spectacles that reinforced messages about the consequences of disloyalty while providing opportunities for remaining employees to demonstrate their commitment to approved ideology through their reactions to their colleagues' fates. The audiences required to witness these proceedings found themselves implicated in the persecution through their presence, creating shared guilt that made subsequent resistance psychologically more difficult. The administrative apparatus that supported mass persecution required the cooperation of employees throughout the ministry hierarchy, from senior policymakers to junior clerks, whose routine tasks became components of systematic oppression when embedded within frameworks designed to identify and eliminate targeted populations. The filing systems that tracked Muggle-born registration, the communication networks that coordinated arrests, and the transportation systems that moved prisoners to detention facilities all depended on workers who could have disrupted the entire operation through non-cooperation, but generally chose compliance over resistance. The normalization of atrocity that characterized this period demonstrates how quickly institutional cultures can adapt to accommodate practices that would have been unthinkable under previous administrations, as employees developed professional routines around activities that violated every principle upon which their careers had originally been based. The psychological techniques that allowed normal people to participate in genocide included compartmentalization that focused attention on immediate tasks rather than ultimate consequences, diffusion of responsibility that spread moral culpability across so many participants that no individual felt entirely responsible, and ideological justification that reframed persecution as necessary protection of legitimate interests. The collaboration between ministry officials and private business interests during this period reveals how totalitarian movements exploit existing economic relationships to implement policy through seemingly voluntary compliance rather than obvious coercion. The contracts offered to companies willing to exclude Muggle-born employees or customers created market pressures that made discrimination appear to be natural business decisions rather than politically motivated persecution, while the threat of regulatory retaliation against non-compliant businesses ensured widespread cooperation without requiring direct government control of private enterprise. The international implications of the ministry's corruption extended far beyond British magical society to encompass relationships with foreign governments and magical institutions that had previously viewed the British ministry as a reliable partner in maintaining international magical law and cooperation. The transformation of a respected democratic government into an instrument of ethnic persecution damaged Britain's reputation and credibility in ways that would take decades to repair, while providing examples that other extremist movements could study and potentially replicate in their own societies. The eventual collapse of Death Eater control, following Voldemort's defeat, revealed the extent to which governmental institutions had been corrupted and the challenges involved in restoring legitimate democratic processes after extended periods of authoritarian rule. The trials of collaborators raise difficult questions about individual versus institutional responsibility, while the reconstruction of damaged departments required not just personnel changes, but fundamental reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. The legacy of this period in Ministry history continues to influence wizarding political culture long after the immediate crisis has passed, creating skepticism about governmental authority, while also demonstrating the importance of civic engagement and institutional vigilance in maintaining democratic systems that serve public welfare rather than private ambition. The ease with which supposedly stable democratic institutions had been corrupted into instruments of oppression serves as permanent reminder that liberty requires constant defense by citizens willing to resist the gradual erosion of rights and freedoms that occurs whenever fear and prejudice are allowed to override constitutional principles and moral law. In the deepest levels of the Ministry of Magic, behind doors that bear no departmental identification and down corridors that appear on no official architectural plans, there exists a realm of magical experimentation that pushes the boundaries of what wizarding law and human decency should permit. The Department of Mysteries houses researchers whose work transcends the normal limits of magical study to encompass investigations that treat human suffering as acceptable cost for advancing knowledge that serves no purpose beyond satisfying intellectual curiosity and feeding ambitions that have long since abandoned any pretense of serving the greater good of magical society. The unspeakables who labor in these hidden chambers have sworn oaths of secrecy so comprehensive that they cannot discuss their work even with family members, creating psychological isolation that gradually erodes their connection to normal human relationships and moral frameworks that might otherwise constrain their willingness to pursue research that treats sentient beings as expendable resources for advancing theoretical understanding of magical forces that were perhaps never meant to be fully comprehended by mortal minds. The brain room represents perhaps the most disturbing example of how the pursuit of knowledge can become divorced from wisdom when researchers lose sight of the human cost of their investigations. The massive tank that dominates this chamber contains dozens of human brains suspended in green liquid that preserves their tissue while maintaining the neural pathways that once housed consciousness, personality, and everything that made these organs more than mere biological matter, before they were harvested from sources whose identities remain classified in files that few living wizards possess clearance to access. The experiments conducted on these preserved minds involve techniques that probe the nature of thought, memory, and consciousness through methods that would have driven their original owners to madness had they remained aware during the procedures that reduced their intellectual essence to laboratory specimens. The tentacle-like projections that emerge from each brain represent externalized thoughts given physical form, creating manifestations of human cognition that can be observed, measured, and manipulated by researchers who study the mechanics of consciousness, while remaining deliberately ignorant of the ethical implications of their methodology. The aggressive behavior that these thought tentacles display toward living humans suggests that some remnant of awareness persists within the preserved tissue, creating a form of existence that is neither truly alive nor mercifully dead, but trapped in a state that might represent the closest thing to hell that magical science has ever achieved. The victims of this research exist as conscious prisoners within their own preserved neural matter, aware enough to suffer, but powerless to communicate their agony to researchers who view their distress as interesting data rather than evidence of ongoing torture. Ron Weasley's encounter with these specimens demonstrates the active malevolence that characterizes their behavior toward the living, as the tentacles wrapped around him with strength and determination that spoke of deliberate intent rather than mere reflexive response to stimuli. The difficulty that Harry experienced in severing the connections between Ron and the attacking brain tissue suggests magical properties that go beyond simple preservation to encompass enhancement and modification of normal neural function in ways that serve experimental rather than humanitarian purposes. The Time Room contains experiments that push the boundaries of temporal magic far beyond the regulated time turners used for educational and emergency purposes, encompassing research into the fundamental nature of causality and the possibility of creating permanent alterations to historical events. The massive bell jars that line this chamber contain temporal anomalies, where different rates of time passage create pockets of accelerated or decelerated existence that trap whatever falls within their influence in cycles of temporal distortion that can stretch moments into eternities or compress years into heartbeats. The specimens contained within these temporal prisons experience existence at rates so dramatically different from normal time that their consciousness becomes fundamentally incompatible with ordinary reality, creating forms of psychological torture that exploit the very nature of perception and awareness to inflict suffering that transcends physical pain, to encompass the dissolution of sequential thought and coherent identity. The researchers who maintain these experiments observe the effects of temporal distortion on living subjects while remaining safely outside the influence of forces that they unleash but cannot fully control. The baby-faced Death Eater who fell into one of these temporal anomalies during the battle in the Department of Mysteries experienced rapid aging and regression in cycles that demonstrated the complete loss of linear existence that characterizes exposure to uncontrolled time magic. His transformation from adult wizard to infant and back again occurred repeatedly within the span of moments, creating a form of existence where personal identity becomes impossible to maintain and consciousness fragments under the strain of experiencing life in temporal patterns that human psychology was never designed to accommodate. The love chamber represents perhaps the most philosophically disturbing aspect of the department's research program, as it attempts to quantify and manipulate the most fundamental human emotion through techniques that reduce love to mere magical force that can be studied, measured, and potentially weaponized for purposes that its researchers prefer not to discuss even among themselves. The experiments conducted within this sealed chamber involve techniques for artificially inducing, enhancing, and eliminating emotional bonds between subjects whose consent for such manipulation was either never sought or obtained through coercion that makes meaningful agreement impossible. The magical force that emanates from behind the chamber's locked door carries influences so profound that even brief exposure can overwhelm the psychological defenses of trained auras and experienced ministry officials, creating alterations in personality and emotional response that persist long after direct contact with the experimental environment has ended. The researchers who work within this chamber must undergo regular psychological evaluation and memory modification to prevent the gradual corruption of their own emotional lives by prolonged exposure to forces that treat love as a variable, to be manipulated rather than a sacred aspect of human experience. The subjects of these experiments include both volunteers who were misled about the nature of the research they were agreeing to support and involuntary participants whose presence in the chamber represents kidnapping disguised as scientific necessity. The techniques used to study love's effects include the systematic breaking and reforging of emotional bonds between partners, the artificial creation of romantic and familial attachments between strangers, and the complete elimination of capacity for emotional connection in subjects who are then studied to understand how love's absence affects magical ability and psychological stability. The space chamber houses experiments that attempt to map and manipulate the relationship between physical location and magical influence, creating environments where the normal rules of geography and distance become meaningless. As researchers explore the possibility of folding space to enable instantaneous travel and communication across unlimited distances. The dangers inherent in such research include the creation of spatial anomalies that can trap researchers in pocket dimensions where normal physics cease to function, and escape becomes impossible without external intervention that may never arrive. The test subjects used in these experiments often disappear entirely from normal space-time, their fates unknown, but presumably horrific, based on the occasional screams and pleas for help that emerge from spatial distortions, before fading into silence that may represent death, madness, or translation to dimensions where human consciousness cannot survive intact. The researchers who conduct these experiments maintain detailed logs of their procedures, while carefully avoiding speculation about what happens to subjects who fail to return from their journeys into manipulated space. The planetary models that fill portions of this chamber serve dual purposes as both educational displays and active components of experiments that test the relationship between celestial mechanics and magical force, creating situations where subjects are exposed to gravitational and temporal effects that replicate conditions found on other worlds or in the void between stars. The physical and psychological stress that such exposure creates often proves fatal, but the data gathered from these deaths provides insights into the limits of human adaptation that researchers consider valuable enough to justify continued experimentation, despite mounting casualty rates. The death chamber represents the culmination of the department's research into the boundary between life and death, housing experiments that attempt to map the process of dying and explore the possibility of reversing or controlling the transition from living to dead states. The ancient archway that dominates this chamber serves as a portal to whatever realm awaits consciousness after physical death, but the researchers who study it have perverted its natural function into an instrument for observing and potentially manipulating the dying process in ways that violate the most fundamental principles of magical ethics. The veil that hangs within the archway whispers with voices of the dead who have become trapped in the liminal space between life and death, their consciousness caught in a state of partial transition that allows the living to communicate with them while denying them the peace that death should provide. The experiments conducted using this phenomenon include attempts to extract information from the recently deceased, efforts to reverse the dying process in subjects who have already begun the transition to death, and research into the possibility of controlling the destination of consciousness after physical death. The subjects used in these experiments include both volunteers who agreed to participate in exchange for promises that their loved ones would be contacted after their deaths, and involuntary participants whose murders were disguised as research-related accidents. The techniques used to study the dying process often involve prolonging death over extended periods while maintaining consciousness throughout the transition, creating experiences of suffering that exceed anything possible through conventional torture because they exploit the fundamental vulnerability of consciousness during its most profound transformation. The unspeakables who work in this chamber must undergo regular psychological evaluation to monitor their mental stability as prolonged exposure to death and the voices of the trapped dead gradually erodes their connection to normal life and healthy relationships. Many develop obsessions with their own mortality that manifest in either reckless behavior designed to hasten their own deaths or paranoid precautions that make normal social interaction impossible as they attempt to avoid any situation that might trigger their transition to the state they have. spent their careers studying. The creation of Inferi through necromantic research represents one of the department's most obviously evil projects, as it involves the systematic reanimation of corpses whose original souls have moved beyond the reach of earthly magic, leaving behind shells of flesh and bone that can be animated through dark arts, but lack any of the consciousness or personality that made them human during life. The techniques used to create these creatures require not just the bodies of the dead, but active participation in the murder of living subjects, whose deaths provide the magical energy necessary to power reanimation spells. The military applications of Inferi research have attracted support from ministry officials who view these creatures as potential weapons that could provide advantages in conflicts where the loss of living soldiers might prove politically unacceptable. But the researchers involved in their creation understand that the techniques they develop could easily be adapted for terrorist purposes by anyone willing to commit the murders necessary to power such magic. The security measures that surround this research include assassination protocols designed to eliminate researchers whose knowledge might be captured by enemies, creating work environments where paranoia and mutual suspicion are necessary survival tools. The testing procedures used to evaluate Inferi effectiveness involve scenarios that replicate combat conditions while using living subjects as targets, whose deaths provide data about the creature's capacity for violence and their ability to follow complex orders under battlefield stress. The researchers who conduct these tests maintain emotional distance from their work by focusing on technical aspects of creature behavior while avoiding consideration of the human cost of research that requires ongoing murder to produce results that serve no purpose beyond satisfying military curiosity about unconventional weapons. The magical creature breeding programs conducted within the department's hidden laboratories encompass efforts to create new species optimized for specific purposes that natural evolution never intended, combining the characteristics of existing creatures through techniques that cause tremendous suffering to the subjects involved, while producing offspring that exist in violation of natural law and biological compatibility. The hybrid creatures that result from these experiments often possess magical abilities that exceed those of their parent species, but their psychological stability and capacity for normal creature relationships are invariably compromised by the artificial nature of their creation. The dragons bred for enhanced aggression and magical resistance represent perhaps the most successful of these programs, producing creatures whose natural territorial instincts have been amplified into permanent states of rage that make them unsuitable for any purpose beyond warfare and destruction. The techniques used to achieve these modifications involve magical alterations to developing embryos combined with environmental conditions designed to maximize stress and hostility, creating animals whose entire existence is defined by suffering that has been deliberately inflicted to serve human purposes. The researchers who work with these creatures must employ increasingly extreme safety measures as their subjects grow larger and more dangerous, but the casualty rates among laboratory staff continue to climb as creatures bred for violence inevitably turn against their creators with abilities that exceed anything their natural counterparts could achieve. The disposal of failed experiments often involves techniques that amount to torture rather than humane euthanasia, as researchers attempt to gather final data from dying creatures whose artificial nature makes normal death impossible to achieve quickly or painlessly. The memory extraction and modification techniques developed within the department's psychological research division represent systematic exploration of methods for stealing, altering, and implanting human memories through procedures that cause permanent damage to subjects' capacity for normal thought and identity formation. The applications of this research extend far beyond therapeutic treatment of trauma victims to encompass interrogation techniques that can extract information from unwilling subjects, and behavior modification programs that can alter personality and moral reasoning through selective editing of formative experiences. The volunteer subjects recruited for this research are typically drawn from populations whose absence would not be noticed by authorities or family members, including homeless wizards, elderly patients in long-term care facilities, and prisoners whose sentences include participation in medical research as alternatives to extended incarceration in Azkaban. The consent procedures used with these subjects often involve memory modifications that prevent them from fully understanding the nature of the experiments they are agreeing to participate in, creating circular situations where the research itself eliminates the possibility of meaningful consent to continued participation. The memory modifications performed on researchers working within the department serve dual purposes of maintaining security while protecting their psychological stability through selective elimination of traumatic experiences that might otherwise interfere with their ability to continue participating in research that violates basic human decency. The irony of using the same techniques on themselves that they employ against unwilling subjects is not lost on senior researchers, but the practical necessity of maintaining their workforce's functional capacity overrides ethical concerns about the consent and autonomy of their own employees. The long-term effects of working within the Department of Mysteries include psychological changes that extend far beyond simple job-related stress to encompass fundamental alterations in researchers' capacity for empathy, moral reasoning, and normal human relationships. The security clearances required for such work necessitate background investigations that effectively eliminate candidates whose moral flexibility might prove insufficient for the demands of research that treats human beings as expendable resources for advancing theoretical knowledge that serves no beneficial purpose. The retirement procedures for department employees involve comprehensive memory modification designed to eliminate their knowledge of classified research while preserving enough professional experience to allow them to function in civilian careers. But the artificial nature of these edited memories often creates psychological problems that manifest years or decades after separation from government service. The suicide rates among former unspeakables significantly exceed those found in other ministry departments, suggesting that the human cost of this research extends beyond immediate subjects to encompass everyone involved in its conduct and oversight. The oversight mechanisms that supposedly govern department research exist primarily on paper, as the secrecy requirements that protect classified projects also prevent external review by ethicists or legal authorities who might question the appropriateness of techniques that push the boundaries of what magical law should permit. The internal review boards that evaluate proposed research are staffed entirely by department employees whose careers depend on continued funding and whose psychological adaptation to institutional culture makes them incapable of providing meaningful oversight of colleagues whose work they have been conditioned to view as necessary, despite its obvious moral problems. The ultimate tragedy of the Department of Mysteries lies not in any single experiment or research program, but in its demonstration of how easily human curiosity can be perverted into systematic cruelty when institutional power combines with secrecy to create environments where normal, moral constraints cease to function effectively, allowing researchers to convince themselves that their pursuit of knowledge justifies any amount of suffering they choose to inflict on subjects who exist, in their minds, primarily as sources of data, rather than fellow human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. Beyond the grand battles and heroic sacrifices that dominate the recorded history of Voldemort's reign of terror, There exists a catalogue of smaller horrors that reveal the true scope of his movement's impact on ordinary wizarding families, whose only crime was existing in a world where their blood status, their beliefs, or simply their misfortune made them targets for violence that served no strategic purpose beyond satisfying the sadistic appetites of followers who had learned to find pleasure in the systematic destruction of innocent lives. The Roberts family's ordeal during the Quidditch World Cup represents not an isolated incident of Death Eater excess, but a deliberate demonstration of the movement's core philosophy, that Muggle lives possess no inherent value beyond their utility as entertainment for those whose magical abilities grant them the power to inflict suffering without consequence. Mr. Roberts, his wife, and their 2 young children were selected not because they posed any threat to Death Eater operations, but because their vulnerability made them perfect subjects for the kind of public torture that served both as recreation for the perpetrators and as warning to any wizards who might harbour sympathetic feelings toward non-magical populations. The methodical nature of their humiliation reveals the calculated cruelty that characterized Death Eater operations, even when no military objective was at stake. The hooded figures who suspended the family in midair moved with the practiced coordination of people who had performed similar demonstrations many times before, their wands working in concert to create a spectacle that transformed human beings into marionettes, whose contorted movements provided amusement for spectators who had gathered to watch fellow humans reduced to objects existing solely for their entertainment. The particular horror of the children's involvement in this torture cannot be overstated, as the Death Eaters deliberately included the youngest and most vulnerable members of the family in their display, not from oversight, but from understanding that watching parents see their children brutalized would amplify the psychological impact of the physical abuse being inflicted. The 2 small figures, twisted into grotesque shapes above the crowd, experienced terror that no child should endure, while their parents were forced to witness their offspring's suffering without any power to intervene or provide comfort. The magical techniques employed during this torture were chosen specifically for their capacity to cause maximum humiliation while avoiding immediate death, as the Death Eaters understood that prolonged suffering provided more entertainment value than quick execution and served their propaganda purposes more effectively than simple murder. The spells that manipulated the family's bodies created pain that was both physical and psychological, as the victims remained conscious throughout their ordeal, while being forced to perform movements that violated their dignity and autonomy in the most fundamental ways possible. The crowd of wizards who witnessed this atrocity included not just Death Eaters, but ordinary magical citizens whose reactions ranged from active participation to passive observation, with few attempting to intervene on behalf of victims who represented everything that the watching crowd had been taught to view as inferior and dispensable. The normalization of such violence within certain segments of wizarding society demonstrates how successfully supremacist ideology had penetrated mainstream magical culture, creating acceptance for cruelties that should have horrified any decent person regardless of their opinions about blood purity or magical superiority. The aftermath of the Roberts family's torture involved memory modification that was intended to eliminate their recollection of magical elements while leaving them with psychological trauma that they would be unable to understand or explain to anyone who might provide help. This approach represented perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire incident, as the victims were left to cope with severe emotional damage while being denied even the comfort of understanding what had been done to them or why they continued to suffer from nightmares and anxiety that seemed to have no rational explanation. The children's recovery from this experience was complicated by their young age, and the particular vulnerability that made them unable to process trauma through normal psychological mechanisms. The memory modifications performed on them were necessarily crude and incomplete, leaving them with fractured recollections that included enough detail to cause ongoing distress while eliminating the context that might have allowed them to seek appropriate treatment or support from mental health professionals trained to deal with such extraordinary circumstances. Charity Burbage's murder at Malfoy Manor demonstrates how the Death Eater movement had evolved beyond simple terrorism to encompass systematic elimination of anyone whose work or beliefs challenged their ideological foundations, regardless of whether such individuals posed any practical threat to their operations or objectives. Her crime, in the eyes of her killers, was not espionage or active resistance, but the teaching of tolerance and understanding between magical and non-magical populations through academic courses that encourage students to question supremacist assumptions about inherent superiority based on blood status. The professor of Muggle studies at Hogwarts had spent her career trying to build bridges between communities that Death Eater ideology required to remain separate and hostile. Her research and teaching representing everything that Voldemort's followers found threatening about educational approaches that emphasized common humanity over artificial distinctions based on magical ability. Her articles in the Daily Prophet defending the rights and dignity of Muggle-born wizards had made her a target not just for assassination, but for the kind of ritualized killing that would serve as warning to other educators who might be tempted to challenge approved doctrine. The dinner party setting chosen for her execution transformed what might have been a simple murder into a theatrical performance designed to demonstrate Death Eater power, while providing entertainment for gathered supporters whose presence at such an event revealed the social acceptance that systematic murder had achieved within certain circles of magical society. The guests who watched Charity Burbage plead for her life while suspended above their dinner table were not forced attendees, but willing participants in a celebration that treated human sacrifice as appropriate dinner entertainment. The particular cruelty of forcing Severus Snape to watch her execution while she begged him for salvation demonstrates Voldemort's sophisticated understanding of psychological torture, as he used the murder not just to eliminate an ideological enemy, but to deepen the trauma and complicity of followers, whose loyalty he wished to ensure through shared participation in atrocities that would make future defection psychologically unbearable. Snape's visible distress at witnessing the death of a former colleague served Voldemort's purposes, while adding layers of suffering that extended far beyond the immediate victim. The feeding of her corpse to Nagini, following the execution, reveals the complete dehumanization that characterized Death Eater attitudes toward their victims, as they treated the remains of someone who had dedicated her life to education and understanding as nothing more than food for a pet whose dietary preferences reflected her master's contempt for human life and dignity. This final violation ensured that even death provided no escape from degradation, as Charity's body became fuel for the creature that symbolized everything evil about the movement that had murdered her. The systematic targeting of Muggle-born families during the period of Death Eater governmental control represents perhaps the most comprehensive attempt at genocide in recorded magical history, as official policy was implemented through both legal persecution and extrajudicial violence, designed to eliminate entire bloodlines from wizarding society while terrorizing any pure-blood families who might harbor sympathetic feelings toward those designated for destruction. The Catamol family's experience during this period illustrates how quickly ordinary lives could be destroyed when governmental power was turned towards systematic persecution of targeted populations. Mary Catamol's arrest on fabricated charges of stealing her wand from a rightful wizard owner demonstrated how legal procedures could be perverted into instruments of predetermined persecution while maintaining facades of due process that provided psychological comfort to those implementing policies designed to achieve ethnic cleansing through administrative efficiency. Her husband Reg's desperation to save his wife and protect his children from the consequences of her blood status reveals the impossible choices that Death Eater policies created for families whose only crime was loving someone, designated as unworthy of continued existence within magical society. His willingness to risk everything in hopeless attempts to secure her release demonstrates both the depth of marital devotion and the complete absence of legitimate channels through which such loyalty might be expressed safely. The children who were left orphaned or separated from parents during this campaign of systematic persecution experienced trauma that went beyond simple loss to encompass the knowledge that their families had been destroyed not through accident or disease, but through deliberate policies implemented by people who viewed their suffering as acceptable cost for achieving ideological objectives that required the elimination of everyone who failed to meet arbitrary standards of blood purity. The Creevy family's persecution demonstrates how Death Eater targeting extended beyond immediate victims to encompass anyone whose association with Muggle-born individuals made them suspect in the eyes of authorities who viewed tolerance itself as evidence of disloyalty to approved ideology. Colin and Dennis Creevy's enthusiasm for magical education and their obvious delight in being part of the wizarding world made them particularly offensive to purists who believed that such joy in magical participation represented contamination of sacred traditions by those unworthy of access to wizarding culture. Their father's Muggle photography business became grounds for harassment and economic persecution that was designed to force the family into poverty and social isolation, while demonstrating to other mixed families the consequences of maintaining connections with non-magical relatives and occupations. The systematic destruction of their economic foundation served dual purposes of eliminating their capacity for independent survival while providing object lessons about what awaited families who refused to abandon Muggle connections in praise, favor of complete integration into pureblood social structures. The murder of Colin Creevy during the Battle of Hogwarts represents the ultimate tragedy of a young person whose crime was being born into circumstances that Death Eater ideology could not tolerate, his death serving no tactical purpose beyond satisfying the bloodlust of killers who had been taught to view anyone with Muggle heritage as inherently expendable, regardless of their individual character, achievements, or contributions to the magical community they had embraced with such enthusiasm. The small communities throughout magical Britain that were targeted for collective punishment based on their support for Muggle rights or their harboring of fugitives experienced forms of terrorism that were designed to eliminate not just immediate opposition but the social structures that made resistance possible. Entire villages were sometimes subjected to attacks that killed indiscriminately while sending messages about the consequences of defying Death Eater authority or providing assistance to those designated as enemies of the pure blood state. The magical damage inflicted on these communities often included curses that poisoned the land itself, making agricultural recovery impossible while ensuring that survivors would be unable to rebuild their lives in locations that held familial and cultural significance, spanning generations of magical settlement. These environmental attacks represented warfare against the very foundation of rural magical life, eliminating not just current opposition, but the possibility of future resistance from communities that might otherwise have served as refuges for those fleeing persecution. The psychological impact on children who witnessed such attacks created lasting trauma that affected their magical development and their capacity for normal social relationships throughout their adult lives. Many survivors of community-wide massacres never fully recovered their ability to trust others or to believe in the possibility of safety and security within magical society, carrying with them permanent scars that influenced every subsequent relationship and life decision. The displacement of entire populations from their traditional homes created refugee problems that overwhelmed the resources of communities that attempted to provide sanctuary for those fleeing Death Eater persecution, while the constant movement required for survival prevented displaced families from establishing the stable environments that children needed for healthy psychological development. The nomadic existence forced upon these refugees created conditions where education became impossible and cultural traditions were lost, as survival took precedence over all other considerations. The medical consequences of prolonged stress and malnutrition among refugee populations included both physical illness and psychological breakdown that manifested in various forms of magical instability and emotional trauma that persisted long after immediate physical threats had been removed. Mungo's hospital found itself overwhelmed with patients whose conditions reflected not just direct injuries from Death Eater attacks, but the cumulative health effects of extended periods living under conditions of constant fear and deprivation. The breakdown of normal family structures under the pressure of persecution and displacement created situations where children became separated from parents and siblings, often permanently, as the chaos of flight and hiding made systematic record-keeping impossible, while the need for security prevented the kind of organized searches that might have reunited divided families after immediate dangers had passed. The long-term social consequences of these separations included generations of magical citizens who grew up without knowledge of their heritage or family connections. The economic warfare conducted against targeted populations extended beyond individual persecution to encompass systematic destruction of the businesses, institutions, and social networks that supported non-pure blood participation in magical society. Banks that served Muggle-born customers found their operations disrupted through both legal restrictions and physical attacks, while schools that maintained inclusive admission policies were subjected to funding cuts and administrative interference designed to force them to abandon their integrationist approaches. The cultural institutions that had traditionally celebrated diversity within magical society were systematically targeted for destruction or conversion to serve Death Eater propaganda purposes, their libraries burned, and their artifacts confiscated for private collections belonging to pure-blood families who viewed such cultural treasures as rightfully belonging to those whose bloodlines granted them exclusive claim to magical heritage and tradition. The international implications of this domestic terrorism included damage to Britain's relationships with foreign magical governments and institutions that had previously viewed the British ministry as a reliable partner in maintaining international magical law and cooperation. The transformation of a respected democracy into an instrument of ethnic persecution isolated Britain within the global magical community, while providing propaganda opportunities for other extremist movements that could point to British policies as justification for their own supremacist agendas. The long-term recovery from this period of systematic persecution required not just the restoration of legal protections and governmental legitimacy, but comprehensive efforts to rebuild the social trust and community cohesion that had been deliberately destroyed through policies designed to eliminate the possibility of cooperation between different segments of magical society. The psychological healing required for both victims and perpetrators of this violence extended far beyond individual therapy to encompass community-wide programs designed to address collective trauma and prevent the kind of social fragmentation that had made such persecution possible. The commemoration of this period in magical history faces the challenge of honoring victims' suffering while avoiding the kind of detailed documentation that might provide instruction manuals for future extremist movements seeking to replicate Death Eater methods in different contexts or societies. The balance between preserving historical memory and preventing the spread of dangerous knowledge requires careful consideration of how much detail should be preserved in public records versus classified archives that limit access to information that serves legitimate research purposes without enabling those who might seek to apply such lessons for destructive purposes. The ultimate lesson embedded in these civilian casualties extends beyond magical society to encompass universal human truths about how quickly civilized behavior can collapse when fear and prejudice are allowed to override basic decency and respect for human dignity, demonstrating that the protection of innocent life requires constant vigilance from citizens, willing to resist the gradual erosion of rights and freedoms that occurs whenever hatred is allowed to masquerade as policy and violence is permitted to present itself as justice. In the darkest recesses of the magical world, where ancient forces that predate human civilization continue to hunger for suffering and despair, there exist creatures whose very nature represents the corruption of everything that makes existence bearable. These beings were not born from natural evolution or divine creation, but emerged from the wounds that evil inflicts upon reality itself, manifestations of human cruelty and despair given form and consciousness that seeks only to perpetuate the conditions that brought them into being through the systematic destruction of hope, happiness, and the will to continue living. Dementors stand as perhaps the most terrifying example of how prolonged exposure to human evil can poison the very fabric of magical reality, creating entities that embody depression in its most absolute and inescapable form. These hooded specters drift through the world like living embodiments of clinical despair, their presence draining warmth and joy from any environment while feeding on the positive emotions that allow sentient beings to find meaning and purpose in existence. Their influence extends far beyond simple sadness to encompass the complete elimination of hope itself, leaving victims trapped in psychological states where death appears not as tragedy, but as merciful release from suffering that seems designed to continue forever. The origins of these creatures remain shrouded in mystery that may be necessary for the sanity of those who study them, but the historical evidence suggests they emerged during periods of particular cruelty and despair in human history, coalescing from the accumulated anguish of victims whose suffering reached levels that reality itself could not contain without creating permanent scars in the magical environment. They represent not merely dangerous creatures that can be studied and understood, but active violations of natural law that continue to spread their influence like spiritual cancer through any population unfortunate enough to encounter them. Their method of feeding reveals the sophisticated cruelty that characterizes their interaction with human consciousness, as they do not simply kill their victims, but systematically strip away every psychological defense mechanism that allows people to cope with trauma and maintain emotional stability under stress. The process begins with the elimination of recent happy memories, progressing backward through the victim's psychological history until nothing remains but the accumulated pain, fear, and despair that every life inevitably contains, when stripped of the positive experiences that provide context and meaning to suffering. The Dementor's kiss represents the ultimate expression of their malevolent nature, going beyond simple murder to encompass the complete destruction of human consciousness, while leaving the body alive in a state that mocks everything that makes existence meaningful. The victims of this fate continue to breathe and move according to basic biological functions, while being entirely absent from their own lives, creating a form of death that is simultaneously absolute and incomplete, satisfying neither the victim's need for peace nor their loved one's need for closure. Fenrir Greyback's transformation from victim to predator illustrates how magical creatures can be corrupted by prolonged exposure to human evil, turning natural lycanthropy from a tragic medical condition into a weapon for spreading terror and building armies of unwilling soldiers whose humanity has been deliberately destroyed through systematic infection and indoctrination. His approach to werewolf transformation went beyond the accidental bites that created most lycanthropes to encompass deliberate campaigns of infection, targeting children whose young minds could be more easily shaped into instruments of violence and hatred. The particular horror of his methodology lay in his understanding that children bitten during their formative years would grow up viewing their lycanthropy not as affliction to be managed, but as identity to be embraced, creating generations of werewolves whose relationship to their condition was defined by the trauma and abandonment that followed their infection, rather than by medical treatment and social support that might have allowed them to maintain their humanity despite their magical transformation. His pack operated according to principles that combined the worst aspects of human gang behavior with predatory instincts that had been deliberately cultivated through years of encouraging violence and rejection of civilized social norms. The children he infected were raised in environments that celebrated brutality while demonizing the human society that had rejected them, creating psychological conditions where revenge against innocent populations seemed not just justified but morally necessary for maintaining self-respect and group loyalty. The systematic targeting of families with young children during full moon attacks served dual purposes of maximizing psychological trauma within affected communities while ensuring a steady supply of new recruits whose infection occurred under circumstances that made integration into normal magical society psychologically impossible. Parents who watched their children transformed into creatures that society viewed with fear and disgust often found themselves choosing between abandoning their infected offspring or accepting exile from the communities that had previously provided their social identity and economic survival. The Acromantula colony in the Forbidden Forest represents the militarization of naturally dangerous creatures through selective breeding and training programs designed to enhance their aggressive instincts while eliminating any natural hesitation about attacking human targets. The spiders' natural intelligence and social organization made them ideal subjects for conversion into weapons of war, as their existing hierarchy could be exploited to ensure that entire colonies would follow orders from human commanders, while their predatory nature required minimal encouragement to manifest as deadly violence against designated enemies. Aragog's leadership of this colony demonstrates how even creatures with genuine affection for individual humans can be manipulated into serving as instruments of systematic murder when their natural protective instincts are redirected towards serving political objectives that they may not fully understand. His loyalty to Hagrid created emotional vulnerabilities that more manipulative handlers could have exploited to secure cooperation with activities that his moral instincts might otherwise have rejected, showing how personal relationships can become weapons in the hands of those willing to exploit emotional bonds for strategic purposes. The breeding programs that enhanced the spider's size and venom potency created creatures whose natural abilities had been amplified far beyond what evolution had intended, producing animals whose existence violated biological compatibility while serving no purpose beyond maximizing their capacity for causing human suffering. The techniques used to achieve these modifications often proved fatal to the subjects involved, But the successful survivors represented investments in biological warfare that could be deployed against civilian populations with devastating effectiveness. The eggs that these enhanced creatures produced carried genetic modifications that ensured their offspring would inherit the artificial enhancements, while potentially developing new characteristics that their creators had not anticipated or intended, creating possibilities for evolutionary developments that could produce creatures even more dangerous than their parents. The long-term ecological consequences of releasing such artificially modified organisms into natural environments remain unknown, but potentially catastrophic for existing magical ecosystems. The dragon breeding programs conducted by various dark wizards throughout history represent systematic efforts to transform creatures whose natural majesty and power commanded respect into instruments of pure destruction, whose only purpose was spreading terror among populations that had no effective defenses against aerial attacks conducted by beings whose intelligence had been deliberately suppressed in favor of enhanced aggression and magical resistance. The techniques used to achieve these modifications began with careful selection of parent dragons, whose natural temperaments showed particular volatility and willingness to attack humans without provocation, followed by breeding programs that reinforced these characteristics, while eliminating traits that might make the creatures suitable for peaceful coexistence with magical communities. The environments in which these dragons were raised were deliberately designed to maximize stress and hostility while preventing the formation of normal social bonds that might have provided emotional stability. The training methods employed to prepare these creatures for warfare involved systematic brutalization that broke down their natural instincts for self-preservation in favor of suicidal aggression that made them willing to attack targets that posed obvious dangers to their own survival. The handlers who worked with these dragons suffered casualty rates that approached 100% over extended periods, but their deaths were considered acceptable costs for producing weapons that could devastate entire communities in single attacks. The magical modifications performed on captured dragons often involved surgical procedures that enhanced their flame production while eliminating their capacity for normal social interaction with their own species, creating isolated creatures whose only relationship to other living beings was based on violence and domination. The psychological damage inflicted through these procedures created forms of madness that made the dragons unpredictable even for their handlers, leading to incidents where the creatures turned against their creators with abilities that had been artificially enhanced beyond anything their natural counterparts possessed. The creation of Inferi through necromantic magic represents perhaps the most morally disturbing aspect of dark creature research, as it requires not just the bodies of the dead but the systematic murder of living victims whose deaths provide the magical energy necessary to animate corpses that have been stripped of everything that made them human during life. These creatures exist in violation of natural law and spiritual order, their presence in the world serving as constant reminders of the lengths to which evil will go in pursuit of power that serves no constructive purpose. The reanimation process itself involves techniques that trap fragments of consciousness within dead flesh, while denying these remnants any agency or capacity for independent thought, creating a form of existence that combines the worst aspects of death and life while providing none of the benefits of either state. The awareness that persists within animated corpses experiences constant agony from inhabiting bodies that are simultaneously dead and animated, creating suffering that cannot be relieved through any known magical or medical intervention. The military applications of Inferi armies attracted support from dark wizards who viewed these creatures as ideal soldiers that required no payment, felt no fear, and could be deployed in situations where living troops might refuse orders or desert when faced with overwhelming opposition. The strategic advantages provided by armies that felt no pain and acknowledged no moral constraints made them attractive weapons for conflicts where conventional military approaches had proven inadequate or politically unacceptable. The psychological impact on living soldiers who fought alongside or against inferior armies included trauma that went beyond normal combat stress to encompass existential horror at witnessing the systematic violation of death itself, creating mental health problems that persisted long after immediate military objectives had been achieved. Veterans of such conflicts often developed pathological fears of death and dying that made normal civilian life impossible, while creating susceptibility to recruitment by Death Eater organizations that promised power over mortality through similar nécromantique technique. The corruption of giants from their original noble nature into violent outcasts represents a systematic campaign of demoralization and brutalization that transformed beings whose natural inclinations toward justice and protection of smaller creatures had made them valuable allies in conflicts against dark forces. The deliberate persecution and marginalization that drove giant communities from their traditional territories created conditions where their natural social structures collapsed, while their survival came to depend on activities that violated their original moral principles. The recruitment techniques that Death Eaters employed among displaced giant populations exploited their justified grievances against wizarding society, while redirecting their anger toward targets that had nothing to do with their original persecution, creating situations where legitimate complaints about historical injustice became justifications for participating in systematic violence against innocent populations. The promises of territory and revenge that secured giant cooperation with Death Eater operations required these proud beings to abandon their traditional values in favor of brutality that corrupted their fundamental nature. The breeding programs designed to enhance giant aggression while reducing their intelligence created creatures that retained their ancestors' physical power while losing the wisdom and moral reasoning that had made them valuable members of magical communities during earlier historical periods. These modified giants became weapons rather than allies, capable of tremendous destruction, but lacking the judgment necessary to distinguish between legitimate military targets and innocent civilians who posed no threat to anyone. The psychological damage inflicted on giants through systematic dehumanization and forced participation in activities that violated their natural morality created forms of madness that manifested as random violence against any available targets, making them dangerous to friend and enemy alike, while eliminating any possibility of their eventual rehabilitation or reintegration into peaceful society. The treatment they received created monsters where none had existed naturally, demonstrating how systematic oppression can transform victims into perpetrators while serving the interests of those who benefit from ongoing conflict and social instability. The basilisk that terrorized Hogwarts during Harry Potter's second year represents a 1,000-year legacy of solitary confinement and systematic abuse that transformed a naturally dangerous creature into something approaching pure malevolence, its intelligence perverted by centuries of isolation, into a focused desire for revenge against the human society that had imprisoned it in darkness, while using its deadly abilities for purposes that violated its fundamental nature as a predator that killed for survival rather than pleasure. The magical compulsions that controlled the basilisk's behavior during its periods of activity eliminated its natural autonomy, while forcing it to serve purposes that its original nature would never have supported, creating internal conflicts that manifested as forms of madness and unpredictable violence that made it dangerous even to those who claimed to control its actions. The creature's ability to kill with direct eye contact or petrify through reflected gaze became weapons in conflicts that had nothing to do with its natural territorial instincts or survival needs. The isolation that defined its existence for centuries created psychological damage that went beyond simple social deprivation to encompass the complete elimination of normal creature relationships and behavioral patterns, leaving it with no frame of reference for interaction with other living beings except through violence and domination. The accumulated rage and despair that resulted from such extended solitary confinement created a creature whose primary emotion was hatred for everything that represented the life and freedom it had been denied. The eventual liberation that came with its death represented mercy for a creature that had been systematically tortured through isolation and compulsion for longer than most species exist as distinct evolutionary lines, its suffering serving no purpose beyond satisfying the ego of a founder whose obsession with blood, purity, had led him to create instruments of vengeance that would persist long after his own death to terrorize future generations of students who had committed no crimes beyond being born to parents he deemed unworthy. The broader ecological impact of dark creature creation and modification extends far beyond individual species to encompass the systematic poisoning of magical environments through the introduction of beings whose existence violates natural law, while their presence corrupts everything they encounter, creating cascade effects that damage entire ecosystems, while eliminating the biodiversity that provides stability and resilience to magical habitats that have evolved over millennia to support life, rather than facilitate systematic destruction. The magical pollution that results from sustained dark creature activity includes environmental changes that persist long after the creatures themselves have been eliminated, creating areas where normal magical flora and fauna cannot survive, while the corrupted landscape serves as breeding ground for additional manifestations of evil that feed on the spiritual contamination left behind by beings whose very existence represents violations of the principles that govern healthy, magical ecosystems. The recovery of areas affected by such corruption requires not just the elimination of immediate threats, but comprehensive restoration efforts that may take decades or centuries to complete, assuming that the damage has not progressed beyond the point where natural healing becomes impossible, and the affected regions become permanent scars on the landscape that serve as monuments to the enduring consequences of choosing evil over good, destruction over creation, hatred over love, in relationships with the natural world that surrounds and sustains all life. In the annals of magical cruelty, where the darkest impulses of human nature are given terrible form through spells that transcend mere physical violence to attack the very essence of consciousness itself, there exists a taxonomy of suffering so comprehensive and systematic that it reveals the depths to which intelligence can sink when empathy is abandoned in favor of power that serves no purpose beyond the satisfaction of watching others endure agony that exceeds anything natural selection ever intended sentient beings to experience or survive. The Cruciatus Curse stands as the pinnacle of magical torture, a spell whose very existence challenges every assumption about the relationship between civilization and barbarity. Its creation, representing not accidental discovery but deliberate research into methods for inflicting pain so pure and intense that victims often prefer death to prolonged exposure to sensations that overwhelm every psychological defense mechanism, while leaving no physical wounds that might provide evidence of the spiritual destruction that has been systematically inflicted upon their consciousness. The curse operates by directly stimulating the nervous system's capacity for registering pain while simultaneously preventing the natural responses that might provide relief through unconsciousness or shock, creating experiences of agony that persist at maximum intensity for as long as the caster maintains concentration and magical energy. The sophistication required to achieve such precise control over another person's sensory experience speaks to understanding of human psychology and neurology that could have been used to eliminate suffering, but was instead perverted into an instrument for maximizing it. The incantation itself, crucio, derives from the Latin word for crucifixion, that ancient method of execution designed not merely to kill, but to create death so prolonged and public that it served as warning to anyone who might consider challenging established authority. The magical version of this torture improves upon its mundane predecessor by eliminating the mercy of eventual death, while maintaining all of the psychological and spiritual destruction that accompanies the systematic breaking of human will through pain that cannot be endured yet cannot be escaped. The casting of an effective Cruciatus curse requires not just magical ability but genuine malice, a psychological state where the caster's desire to cause suffering becomes so pure and focused that it achieves the intensity necessary to bridge the gap between their consciousness and that of their victim. This requirement serves as both protection against accidental casting and revelation of the moral corruption necessary to employ such magic, as only those who have cultivated hatred to the point of pathology can generate the emotional energy that powers such comprehensive violation of another being's autonomy and dignity. Bellatrix Lestrange's mastery of this curse demonstrates how prolonged practice in causing suffering can transform someone from merely cruel individual into something approaching a force of nature dedicated entirely to the systematic and destruction of human happiness and hope. Her ability to modulate the curse's intensity and duration revealed understanding of pain as both art and science, her expertise allowing her to maintain victims on the precise edge between consciousness and madness, while extracting maximum psychological damage from each session of torture she conducted. Her instruction to Harry Potter that "you need to really mean it" when attempting to cast unforgivable curses reveals the psychological mechanism that separates effective dark magic from mere academic understanding of forbidden technique. The curse responds not to intellectual knowledge or proper wand movement, but to the caster's genuine desire to inflict suffering, making it impossible to use for supposedly benevolent purposes, while ensuring that everyone who employs it successfully has crossed moral boundaries that cannot be uncrossed through rationalization or regret. The long-term effects of Cruciatus curse exposure extend far beyond the immediate agony to encompass permanent alterations in brain chemistry and neural pathways that affect victims' capacity for experiencing pleasure, forming relationships, and maintaining basic psychological stability throughout their remaining lives. Frank and Alice Longbottom's continued existence in Street Mungo's hospital demonstrates how the curse can destroy personality and memory while leaving the body alive, creating a form of murder that occurs gradually over extended periods while maintaining the facade that the victims continue to exist as the people they once were. The medical research conducted on long-term Cruciatus victims reveals brain damage consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme stress hormones combined with neural pathway disruption that resembles conditions found in patients who have suffered massive strokes or traumatic brain injuries. Yet the magical nature of the damage makes conventional treatments ineffective, while the ongoing nature of the curse's influence prevents natural healing processes from repairing even minor aspects of the destruction that has been inflicted. The psychological torture that often accompanies physical applications of the Cruciatus curse demonstrates how skilled practitioners combine multiple forms of abuse to achieve psychological destruction that exceeds what pure pain could accomplish alone. Victims are frequently forced to watch loved ones tortured while being unable to intervene, creating trauma that encompasses not just their own suffering but guilt over their inability to protect those they care about most deeply and permanently. The Imperious Curse represents a different but equally devastating form of magical torture that attacks the fundamental basis of human identity by stealing the capacity for independent thought and voluntary action that distinguishes sentient beings from mere objects that respond to external stimuli without consciousness or choice. The violation of free will that this curse accomplishes goes beyond simple mind control to encompass the systematic elimination of selfhood itself, leaving victims trapped within their own consciousness, while watching their bodies perform actions that violate everything they believe about themselves and their values. The curse operates through magical compulsion that bypasses rational thought to control behavior at the level of automatic response, creating situations where victims experience themselves making decisions while simultaneously understanding that these decisions originate from external sources rather than their own desires or moral reasoning. The psychological fragmentation that results from such experiences can persist long after the curse's direct influence ends, as victims struggle to determine which of their thoughts and actions represent authentic self-expression versus residual magical influence. The particular cruelty of this form of control lies in its capacity to force victims to participate in their own destruction while maintaining enough awareness to understand what is happening but insufficient agency to resist or escape the compulsion that drives their behavior. Victims of prolonged Imperious Curse influence often report feeling like passengers in their own bodies, watching helplessly as they commit acts that violate their fundamental moral principles, while being unable to prevent or alter their responses to commands that feel irresistible, despite their obvious wrongness. The resistance training that some individuals develop through natural psychological resilience or specialized education demonstrates that the curse's effectiveness varies according to the victim's mental strength and moral clarity. But even successful resistance requires constant vigilance and emotional energy that gradually exhausts the victim's capacity for normal function, while the ongoing struggle against magical compulsion creates forms of stress that manifest in physical illness and psychological breakdown over extended periods. Harry Potter's natural resistance to Imperious Curse influence during his 4th year at Hogwarts revealed both the possibility of maintaining autonomous will under magical compulsion and the extraordinary effort required to achieve such resistance when every magical force present is designed to eliminate independent thought and replace it with external control that feels increasingly natural and appropriate, the longer it continues to influence the victim's behavior and decision-making processes. Memory modification represents perhaps the most insidious form of magical torture because it attacks the foundation of personal identity while leaving no external evidence that any violation has occurred, creating situations where victims experience themselves as unchanged while everyone who knew them recognizes fundamental alterations in personality, behavior, and basic competence that cannot be explained through normal psychological or medical frameworks, but represent systematic theft of experiences that define their understanding of themselves and their relationships. The techniques employed in memory modification range from simple erasure of specific events to comprehensive restructuring of personal history that replaces authentic experiences with fabricated narratives designed to serve the needs of whoever has performed the modification, rather than preserve any aspect of the victim's original identity or psychological well-being. The most sophisticated practitioners of such magic can implant entire false lifetimes while eliminating traces of the original memories so completely that victims have no awareness that their understanding of their own past has been artificially constructed. Gilderoy Lockhart's fate demonstrates how memory modification can become self-inflicted torture when practitioners become overconfident in their abilities, while lacking the skill necessary to perform such delicate magical procedures safely. His accidental self-erasure, creating a form of existence where he retained basic functions while losing everything that made him a distinct individual with personal history, relationships, and accumulated knowledge that provided context for understanding his place in the world around him. The recovery process for victims of memory modification often proves more traumatic than the original violation, as restoration of authentic memories requires victims to confront evidence that their understanding of their own lives has been systematically falsified, while simultaneously dealing with the psychological impact of experiences that may have been hidden for good reasons, creating situations where healing becomes indistinguishable from additional torture. The ethical questions raised by therapeutic memory modification blur the boundaries between medical treatment and criminal violation, as healers struggle to determine when elimination or alteration of traumatic memories serves the patient's best interests versus when such interventions constitute theft of experiences that, however painful, remain integral parts of the individual's authentic psychological development and personal history that cannot be edited without fundamentally altering their identity in ways that may not represent genuine improvement. The use of legilimency for interrogation purposes transforms what might be a useful diagnostic tool into an instrument for systematic violation of mental privacy that allows skilled practitioners to explore victims' consciousness without consent, while extracting information that the victim might choose to protect even under extreme physical torture, making this technique particularly valuable for interrogators who wish to bypass normal psychological defenses while ensuring that their intrusion leaves no physical evidence. Professor Snape's lessons in occlumency reveal both the possibility of defending against mental intrusion and the difficulty of maintaining such defenses when facing skilled legilimens whose magical abilities exceed the victim's capacity for resistance, creating situations where even partial success in blocking mental invasion requires constant vigilance and energy that interferes with normal psychological function, while the ongoing struggle against intrusion creates stress that manifests in various forms of emotional and behavioral problems. The magical enhancement of conventional torture techniques through healing spells that repair physical damage while maintaining pain creates possibilities for prolonged abuse that exceed anything possible through mundane methods, as victims can be subjected to injuries that would normally prove fatal, while magical intervention ensures their survival to experience additional rounds of systematically administered agony that serves no purpose beyond satisfying the torturer's psychological needs. The development of curse-based interrogation techniques that combine multiple forms of magical torture into comprehensive systems designed to break down every form of psychological resistance demonstrates how systematic evil can evolve beyond individual cruelty to encompass institutional approaches to destroying human dignity and autonomy through methods that are refined through practice and shared among practitioners who view such knowledge as professional expertise rather than evidence of their moral corruption. The long-term psychological effects on practitioners of magical torture include gradual erosion of empathy and normal emotional responses that occurs when individuals repeatedly inflict suffering on others while maintaining the psychological distance necessary to perform such acts without being overwhelmed by guilt or revulsion at their own behavior, creating personality changes that make return to normal social relationships increasingly difficult, as the torturer's capacity for healthy human connection is systematically destroyed through their own actions. The training programs designed to prepare interrogators for using magical torture techniques include psychological conditioning that normalizes cruelty, while providing intellectual frameworks that allow practitioners to view their work as necessary service to legitimate authority, rather than participation in systematic evil, demonstrating how institutional structures can corrupt individual moral reasoning through gradual exposure to increasingly extreme practices that are presented as professional requirements rather than personal choices. The medical treatment of torture victims reveals the limitations of even advanced magical healing when confronted with psychological damage that has been deliberately and systematically inflicted through techniques designed to cause maximum trauma, while preventing normal recovery processes from functioning effectively, creating cases where physical restoration becomes possible, while spiritual healing remains beyond the reach of conventional therapeutic intervention, leaving victims trapped between life and death in states that provide neither normal function nor merciful release. The social consequences of widespread torture include the breakdown of trust between community members, who understand that anyone might be forced to betray others through techniques that make resistance impossible, while the knowledge that such methods exist creates paranoia and social fragmentation that persists long after immediate threats have been eliminated, poisoning relationships and social institutions with suspicion that may never be entirely overcome through legal or therapeutic intervention. The legal frameworks that govern magical torture often prove inadequate for addressing crimes that transcend normal categories of assault or murder to encompass violations of consciousness and identity that existing laws were never designed to recognize or punish appropriately, creating situations where even successful prosecutions fail to provide justice that matches the scope of damage that has been inflicted upon victims whose suffering extends far beyond anything that conventional legal remedies can address or compensate. The ultimate horror of systematic magical torture lies not in any specific technique or individual case, but in its demonstration of how intelligence and magical ability can be perverted into instruments for destroying everything that makes existence meaningful, while creating forms of suffering that serve no purpose beyond satisfying psychological needs that become increasingly pathological as they are indulged through practices that corrupt both victim and perpetrator in ways that may prove irreversible, regardless of any subsequent efforts at justice, healing, or moral redemption. As we reach the end of our journey through the wizarding world's darkest corners, remember that these horrors serve a purpose beyond mere fascination with the macabre. They remind us that evil is not born in a vacuum but grows from choices made by ordinary people who surrender their humanity piece by piece. In understanding how Tom Riddle became Voldemort, how the Ministry fell to corruption, and how good people became complicit in atrocities, we learn the eternal lesson that darkness thrives when light fails to act. Yet even in these disturbing tales, we find hope. In Neville's courage despite his trauma, in Harry's choice to walk toward death for others, in every small act of kindness that defied the spreading shadow. Sleep now, knowing that while darkness exists in every world, real and imagined, the choice to stand against it remains ours to make. In dreams and in waking, may we choose the light, however dim it may seem in the deepest night. Rest well, and remember, even the darkest magic cannot extinguish the spark of human goodness that burns eternal in willing hearts.